I have a lot of amazing friends, okay? And some of them are megachurch pastors. And some of them have a soft spot for celebrity pastors. And some of them even challenge me on some of my ideas. Who would have thought? And so today we're going to have a very necessary conversation. My brother, my friend, I've known this dude for over a decade. We do dirty bulks together in the gym and get fat, claiming to work out. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, we have the man, the myth, the legend, Daniel Golding.
Man, it is good to be here, brother.
All right. So, Daniel, you pastor at one of the fastest growing churches in America. So these are your people, okay? These are your people, all right? Tell us where you pastor, tell us the size of the church, and then we'll get into the conversation here. I'm going to adjust something on my end while you talk to the people real quick.
That's fair. Yeah, so I am the teaching pastor at a church out in Gilbert, Arizona. We're actually technically in Queen Creek, so shout out Queen Creek, Arizona, where all the best of the best live. Church is called Rock Point, and it's been just an amazing thing. We just had Christmas services. We did 10 services, and it feels weird just throwing out a bunch of numbers, but we had just under 13,000 people that showed up over the 10 services, 600 decisions for Christ. So
you said how many?
Just under 13,000 people.
Holy moly.
Yeah,
okay.
It was
Try not
awesome.
to look at that chat. We should get the other chat going because you're looking. Try to look at me. There you go.
Okay. That's fair.
Daniel was like, "Oh, there's chat." And
Jeff
people.
Moore's comment.
Jeff Moore's is in the house. What'd Jeff say?
He's just saying that I want to be a celebrity pastor or something.
Hey, you have the archetype. You are the avatar. You're tall. You're handsome. Right?
Doing what I can.
You have tattoos.
That's right. Yep.
Daniel has really good tattoos.
All the intangibles.
The intangibles. He's working on a six-pack like I am.
That's right, man. Once I get there, then I think I'll have celebrity pastor locked in.
We'll never show the D route, though.
No, the D route is only for Jeff Moore's.
Whoa. Shout out to Pastor Jeff. He'll be on the channel as well. It's super fun having pastors on. Those of you guys that are in Arizona, now you have a point of contact. If you're looking for a church, check out North Point. Is that what it's called?
Rock Point.
Rock
close
Point.
enough.
Close enough.
Close enough. Yeah.
North Point is Andy Sandy.
Yeah.
Rock Point. I've been to Rock Point. Dope church. You guys got a new building. You said you had 13,000 people in attendance for Christmas.
Yeah.
That's insane. So you have no quarrels with big church.
I don't at all. And like Rue said, I'm usually the one playing devil's advocate.
Always playing devil's advocate.
Pushing back against stuff because Rue sits in his little dark box right here and, solves all of the world's church problems while we're actually out in the streets doing this thing. So
while you're actually out air preaching.
That's right.
In the parking lot.
That's right.
Yo, okay. So, I literally spit out my tea when you said that.
That was good.
That was funny. Okay. So, we talked about, you saw the Mike Todd video.
I did.
And I had some critique for Mike Todd. Before we get into the Mike Todd, what people don't know is me and Daniel worked on staff at the same church.
That's right.
Let me adjust your camera a little bit because it's bothering me. Give me one sec. You're good. Don't move. There we go.
There we go.
Okay. Oh yeah, he roasts me all the time. My friends are allowed to roast me. You in the chat, not so much. Okay, so
that's right.
What people don't know is we were on staff at a church before, and you actually got me hired at the church. I've told a story about how I got hired. Maybe we'll tell that story at the end of this video because I think that's a very practical story. But me and you actually came up like huge fans of Stephen Furtick.
Huge. Yeah, man. And even before Furtick, it was Mark Driscoll.
Mark Driscoll.
Mark Driscoll was the man when I was newly saved. And we were huge fans. Yeah. Huge fans of everything they were doing. And
so we have a soft spot. I have a soft spot for Stephen Furtick.
Let's be careful with the we statements.
Okay. I have a soft spot for celebrity pastors.
For sure.
I think there's a utility for them. I just think sometimes they jump out of all kinds of wild statements and never really reel them back in. We were also in the same small group.
Yep.
What year was that?
Man, I think we started that, or I joined into that probably 2012-ish, 2010, somewhere around there.
It was before that. You got married in 2009. You were already in the group for like a year before that.
So 2008, 2007.
Yeah. So we were in the same group for a while.
That was like a decade.
It was a decade, yeah.
For a long time.
Yep. And then we did young adults ministry for a while.
We did. Do you remember when we launched that young adults ministry? The night of the launch.
Block it all out.
Dude, it was Super Bowl Sunday. I don't know how in all the planning that we went to launch, like this whole build up, this whole thing. We go to launch and we realize, dude, our service starts 30 minutes after the Super Bowl starts. And I'll never forget, we like sold the vision to our team and had the worship team go out there, and I preached legitimately to a room of like 3 people.
That's right.
That was like our big launch, man. That was it.
That's right. And you since then connected with Pastor Jeff Morris. Shout out to Jeff, who grew one of the biggest young adults ministries. And when you actually transitioned from the movement to Rock Point, you grew a massive young adults ministry.
Yeah, we literally, and Jeff knows, just copied and paste. So we copied the Jordan and just pasted it in
And how many people
Arizona,
did you guys have showing up on it? Was it Tuesday or Thursday night?
It was Thursday nights, yeah. So when I left and moved back to San Diego, it was about 2.5 years. We had just crossed over 400 in weekly attendance.
400. And that took how long? You said 2.5 years?
About 2.5 years, yeah.
Sheesh.
Yeah.
So like, Daniel is not a novice. He's an incredible communicator. You guys can look up his messages on Rock Point's YouTube channel.
Yep.
And you'll even send me the messages sometimes and be like, hey, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
You know? And so this is not someone that's like a novice. This is not someone that hasn't been around. You've spoken at churches all over the country. You've spoken at tons of camps. And you communicate regularly, again, at one of the fastest growing churches.
Yeah.
So when we talk about just macro idea of celebrity pastors, and massive churches, what is kind of your thoughts on it? What is your assessment on these things?
Yeah, again, I think the challenge that I have is I don't think anybody, Mike Todd, Stephen Furtick, I don't think any of them set out to go, hey, my goal is to be a celebrity pastor, right? I think Mike Todd puts out a series and it goes viral, and next thing you know, this dude's spot is blowing up. And so I think from that premise, I look at it and I go, man, I think through the grace of God, I don't have as much talent as these dudes to be put into situations where at a young age, they're given just huge platforms and huge audiences that they didn't necessarily ask for. And I think it's really easy to throw stones at what they're doing. And in fairness, they definitely don't help themselves out in some regards. But I also think that these are humans, and for me, I look at it and go, man, I get nervous that I have to preach in front of, a weekly attendance is probably 6,000 or so. And if you add the streams and stuff of people who replay sermons, maybe on a high end, 10,000 people are going to listen to my message. And that's like a terrifying thing. I couldn't imagine every single week in and week out as a communicator going, millions of people are going to microanalyze everything I say in the next 45 minutes. You better be brilliant. You better be funny. And you have to do it 52 weeks in a row. So I start from the position of going, I think these guys have an insurmountable burden that is a heavy load that I think collectively as the global church, we can help carry and steward. Because clearly, and again, I think there's some debate on it, but there's a massive anointing on their life, and God is doing something, right? So the question
careful
is,
with that word. They're going to come for you for using that word.
The question is what, right?
Okay.
So I guess that's the premise that I start from.
Okay.
And I think that I don't think there's anybody that does anything perfect. I think there's really poor small churches out there. I think there's really phenomenal small churches out there. So my discrepancy my issue isn't necessarily with the numbers. I think there's amazing big churches and there's terrible big churches. Just like there's amazing small churches and terrible small churches.
Yeah. Because that's also unhelpful too, right? Like just because something is big, therefore God can't be in it.
For sure.
Right? Or just because it is big, God therefore has to be in it. We talked about ends justify the means type of thinking, right? Thinking that just because God allowed in his providence for a church to get big, that means that he was a part of the entire journey, right? Sometimes people get lucky. Sometimes you're at the right place at the right time. Sometimes you're cutting edge on a technology. So I love that, man. I love your heart. And I think you extending empathy to these guys that are in tough positions, I think is really it's good. It's good. And I understand you're not trying to offend your political connects, just in case.
That's right.
Mike Todd needs to get you to speak at Transformation Sunday
Anytime.
for White Sunday, just joking.
Yeah, if he wants to set the bar low so he comes back and reminds everybody how good he is, fly me out and I can teach that week.
Yeah. So you said something really interesting, and you said, it would terrify me if I knew that, hundreds of thousands of people were going to be watching back my 45-minute talk. Or in Mike Todd's case, I mean, his brother's going for hour and a half, 2 hours sometimes.
Oh, crazy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So my question would then be, when we were on the preaching team, there was an actual team. Like, I wasn't going to go up there and jump out the window and say anything crazy, right? Like, you guys would watch usually we would kind of conceptualize the message together. Then you guys will make me say the whole message in front of you, which was really awkward. Talk about preaching to a room of 4 pastors, right? And there was multiple checks and balances before anything ever went up on a Sunday. And when we would skip those checks and balances, a lot of times the messages didn't turn out great, right? That's when stuff. So if you have the self-awareness and the humility to say, man, I'm under pressure just preaching in front of 10,000, wouldn't that logic also be extended to someone that is preaching in front of 100,000 or preaching in front of 1 million? Wouldn't we want to dot every I, cross every T, and not say sloppy things? And if we do say sloppy things, at the very least, come back around and correct it.
100%. In an ideal world, I would think of 1,000% yes. And again, I would also operate under the assumption that every one of these massive pastors that have these massive platforms have something like that. I think the hard part becomes when these platforms grow so quickly and become so massive, there becomes this thing, and again, I've experienced it in different regards in different rooms where it's hard to push back against the main guy unless he's really intentional to create a culture of beat these messages up, push back. You can challenge. Whereas it more becomes that God's anointed one walks in the room, reveals his brilliance, and everybody just that's the best thing I've ever heard. And there isn't really so much of a challenge. And so, again, I don't know if it's a solution. And the other part that the challenge that I have is we just don't know these guys' inner workings in their process. And I would love to hear what they go through, right? And part of how I think we can remove the burden, it was something Julie Shecker taught me a long time ago in preaching, is you have to resist the urge to be brilliant, right? I think that's the part that gets us in the most trouble. I think that there's we do a Thursday sermon programming meeting now, and truly that room is what makes our messages good. It's that collective room that we flesh out the ideas together. There's, pushback, there's discussion, there's new ideas, there's people in that room that don't look like me, that are different gender than me. And collectively we can walk through a process to come up with a sermon that truly isn't my original idea. And so I don't have to walk up and go, I have all this pressure to see if my idea is going to land and get traction with people. It's this is our collective idea that we're going to go and run with, right?
How many people are in the room? I'm just curious.
It depends, but probably 10 to 12.
And are you walking through your entire message with them?
Yeah, so it depends on the week. There's some weeks that we'll walk in, and if we're doing a series going through the book of Romans, you're in Romans 4. So you come in and go, hey, here's the passage. Here's kind of what I'm thinking. I was going to use this intro, or I don't have any idea how I'm going to close this thing. And then the room kind of fleshes it out, and you've got to get the production people all the stuff that they need to be able to get everything ready for the
And it seems it seems like you guys have developed a really healthy culture where you aren't the smartest one in the room.
Yeah, and again, I think that that's something that you still, as the people that are higher up on the organization chart, you have to be really intentional to create that. Because even in our context, where we're on the bigger side of churches, but we're not some massive thing that people know us internationally and whatever. But that's still, I've seen it play out in our small context where there almost becomes this thing where it's this is just his brilliant idea that we all have to get behind. And you have to constantly re-communicate the vision of no, this is where we kind of beat this thing up. And I'm not the smartest person. I'm not coming here with all my brilliant ideas. I actually believe the room is smarter than me, right? It's the whole we's better than me. So you just take that and you exasperate it into millions of followers, millions of views. And dude, it's just got to be such a bizarre, non-natural thing. I could not imagine trying to steward that.
Okay, so I want to bounce a couple theories off of you. Okay, and you tell me what you think about these. Okay. Theory number 1, if many, not all, but many of the guys who are the top G celebrity pastors now were starting a year or two ago, I think they would be doing what I'm doing or something similar to what an Alan Parr is doing and not trying to pastor a local church.
Sure.
Fair assessment?
I think it could be. Yeah. I think it could be.
Yeah. Because I think what happens is we know.
Are you saying that up until a couple years ago, there was no other medium besides the local church to do what they're doing? Yeah,
yes.
Fully agree.
There was no. I mean, you could what? You could go to John Acuff route and be an author.
Yeah.
Right? And shout out to John Acuff. That's my guy. Like, I love John.
Yeah.
Right? You could go the Dave Ramsey route and be a radio broadcaster.
Which John Acuff did for
Which
like
John
2
Acuff
months,
did with Dave Ramsey, right? Dr. Michael Brown does that now. That you can go the Christian television route.
Yeah.
Right? Which is like, ugh, who wants to be on TVN?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no
like who wants to be that guy? And so what happens? You're a young guy, you're charismatic, you're talented, right? And you can communicate, you have the gift of gab, pastor. And
especially when you grow up in a church context.
Especially when you grow up in a church context.
Yeah, no
right?
question.
And so for me, I've always wanted to stay away from the label pastor because I have always saw, which is kind of a segue into our next point, I have always seen it as a pastor is Titus chapter 1. A pastor is 1 Timothy chapter 3.
Okay.
Right? I was a deacon at our church, but like I was never given the title pastor, nor did I ever want it. Right? Like I didn't really want that, right?
Yeah.
And so
you wanted that housing allowance.
I wanted that housing allowance. Shout out to everybody in ministry. Y'all know what we're talking about.
That's the only
They took that housing allowance from me. I was gone 6 months later. For those of you guys that don't know, clergy in ministry get a housing stipend. And so like sometimes half of your income could be tax-free.
Yeah, essentially what it takes to run your household is the IRS allows it to be tax-free.
Yeah.
Like back in the day when you had a parsonage.
Parsonage. Yep. And and that allows pastors to not have to pay as much in taxes and kind of relieve some of the burden.
It's the only financial benefit of being in ministry.
Yeah, because to be fair, the work that pastors do versus the amount of pay per average, it's wild.
Peanuts.
Yeah, it's wild. And so I think if content creation was an option, I feel like more of them would have just been content creators because I don't know anyone in their right mind that'd be like, yeah, I want to go build this big thing where I'm the face of it and I'm responsible for thousands of people, sometimes tens of thousands of souls and spiritual health. Like, that's a different, like, I don't know why anybody would want that burden. If you're just a good communicator and you're repeatedly exhibiting signs that you aren't very sound in doctrine, you aren't really a shepherd. You know what I mean? Like, you aren't necessarily pastoring people in your church. Not to say every head pastor needs to pastor people individually, but you should be pastoring somebody. You should be discipling somebody, right?
Sure.
And so that's my first kind of macro idea. The second idea I was curious is you saw the video and I said, I think the word pastor in their context means something else than the word pastor does in kind of I don't know what you would call Reformed and or evangelical and or Southern Baptist conservative context. When we say pastor, usually we're interchanging it with elder, with overseer, with bishop.
Same qualifications.
But we'll still use the word youth pastor.
Yeah.
And we know daggone well that junior high youth pastor ain't a pastor, right? He's not an actual.
He's barely saved.
Like we letting him just teach the gospel to himself in front of junior high kids, right?
Heck yeah.
I'm joking, right? But
mostly.
But so if these guys have a different view of that word, right? Yeah. And I've seen this. Like they'll be like, so are you a I remember somebody asked me like, "Are you a minister?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" Like, "Yeah, I'm a minister." They're like, "No. Like, are you like ordained by your church?" I'm like, "Well, no, I'm not a pastor." And they're like, "No. Like, are you like a deacon?" And I'm like, "What?" Like, I'm so confused. But we literally use words different. Like, we use these words different. If you're in more of a Reformed conservative community, usually that word pastor is going to be used interchangeably with elder and or bishop. And if you're outside of that community, and I don't know which community does what, but there's definitely different words. So what do you make of all that? Like, I'm assuming at your church, like if someone's a pastor, they're viewed as an elder. If you're ordained as a pastor.
Because we're non-denominational, but we're a part of an association where there's no, theological governance that we have to fall into. But if we had to, we're essentially a Baptist church is the closest to us. And so with a lot of that stuff, we lean pretty conservative in there. And so one of the challenges is you can't even be ordained at our church unless you've been in full-time vocational ministry at a pastor or director level for at least 5 years.
Wow. Wow.
And so that's one of the things that, and again, it doesn't affect your pay. It doesn't affect, it changes how we visibly put you out there, right? To just go, hey, this is our director.
Yep.
And then at 5 years, there's an ordination process you go through to become a pastor. Because for us, we do believe that those qualifications that we see are for pastors, right? They are, those standards are what we're called to live to. And it takes time to get there. For us, it's a big deal. We don't want it to be what it kind of was when I got ordained at our church. It was like, oh yeah, like you got the job, and they like gave me a sword.
I remember that. Yeah,
it was weird. Yeah, it was weird.
Yeah. So, how do you feel about a lead pastor of a church that might be like, yeah, like I don't like Titus 1, not really. Like I don't even have kids yet, or I'm not even married yet.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? In terms of like running your household, making sure your household is good. How do you feel about that subculture where folks are using the title pastor, but maybe they're not? And granted, there's a wide spectrum.
Yeah, that's
there,
what I was going to say.
Right?
Yeah, paint with broad strokes.
Yeah, like Stephen Furtick has been pastoring for 20 years, right? That dude went through Southern Seminary. He was initially very solid when he started, and I could see him seeing that. But even then, like I feel like, man, that dude was like 28, 29 when they planted Elevation, you know? Anyway, so what do you think about that? Like someone that's clearly not an elder holding the title pastor.
I think you're outside of the nuanced conversation of knowing details and who's involved and all of that. I think as a blanket statement, it's a pretty dangerous territory. You're walking in. There's a reason these qualifications are set up, right?
Yes.
Because there's this inherently dangerous thing that comes with any platform, but specifically the platform of a pastor. Again, it's not flesh and bones that we wage war with, but it's spirits and principalities. And you enter into a new level of spiritual attack. There's a reason that these things are in place for there to be accountability, for there to be checks and balances. Because again, the body of Christ is supposed to be this beautiful example of Jesus and his relationship with us.
Yeah, that's good.
And with all of those things and all the exceptions, almost exclusively in the U.S., we see all these celebrity pastors that have blown up. And obviously in different westernized countries, it's happening as well. But it's a really bizarre thing. And I think we've created a really dangerous thing that is now leading us into this post-church world that we're now entering into, right? Where
that's interesting. You drew a line between the two. You draw a line between celebrity pastor culture and post-church culture. Like unpack that for me.
I don't know if it's necessarily just the celebrity pastor thing, but I think it's the celebrity pastor thing. It's the idea that anybody can start a church. There's really no standards to it. You can do your own thing. The idea of what a pastor is to just culture. You go ask somebody, man, post on Instagram, like, what's your viewpoint of churches and pastors? And unfortunately, it's all these people that have had these terrible moral failures, or the people on the far other end of the fringes that are just saying crazy, obnoxious things. That's become the face of the church to a world that doesn't know who Jesus is. And people are walking away from their faith in droves, to a point that, there's surveys showing that by like 2050, Christians will be a massive minority. 20-25% of the population will say that they're Christian at that point. And so I think it's all of these things combined that have created this really, I think, incredible opportunity for those of us that are in this world, that are in this work and, have given our lives to serving the church. I think it's created an incredible opportunity for us, but it's also created some really murky waters.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see how the next few generations play out.
Yeah. What are your thoughts? I mean, you've gone back and forth on this. Like, I take issue with the evangelical industrial complex.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
we've talked about this.
Take issue with like just that entire system, of like come speak at my thing and I'll come speak at your thing. And there becomes this like club of guys that are kind of all on each other's boards, and then the conferences around it, and then the festivals around the conferences, and then tours and all this sort of stuff. I don't know if when you're talking about people being unchurched, like, I don't know if that adds a net positive or a net negative to everything.
Yeah. And again, we've talked about this where there's a lot of it that I look at and I go, yeah, a lot of this is really weird, right? Mm-hmm. Same guys speak at each other's conferences all year. We all pay a bunch of money. And most of the time it's pastors flying around and going to these things, mm-hmm. right? That are worshiping at the altar of these dudes. Mm-hmm. And if you were to go to 8 different conferences around the country in 2023 and mm-hmm. see the same guys, you're going to hear the same talk, right? Mm-hmm. They typically have one conference talk they go around and they do. And it's a great money-making thing for them. And I also believe that they think that they're doing some positive good. I think they're probably just trying to pay their bills and feed their kids. Mm. Now, I look at a lot of that and I go, I don't know how helpful this is. Mm-hmm. I haven't been a conference dude for a long time now. There's much more practical things that pastors can do to get training. But where you and I have a bit of a disagreement where we've had pushback is you would even go to a church of our scale and size and ask questions of like, hey, is this a net positive, mm-hmm. right? And we've had those discussions, mm-hmm. which again, I think is a healthy discussion to have. I think the part that I've always appreciated about our friendship and relationship is we just have conversations and push back. And I think that the truth is somewhere in the middle. Right. I don't think that having things just stand alone as these altars you can't touch or these things you can just never speak about, I think that's a really dangerous thing that leads you into some weird places. Yep. But I look at our church, because again, if you look at us, we are a Christian industrial complex. We are a large organization with a large staff. We have over 100 staff members. Mm-hmm. You know, we bring in millions of dollars. And if somebody were to come in and microanalyze where that money goes, the mm-hmm. bulk of that money, just like any church and nonprofit, is going to go to facilities and staffing, mm-hmm. right? The staff that we have. And so somebody's like, well, none of the money actually goes to feeding the homeless.
Right, which was kind of my critique.
That's right, right? And taking care of the orphans and the widows. Mm-hmm. And where I always push back is that, well, what is the primary purpose of us as the ecclesia, right? Mm-hmm. As the local body. Mm-hmm. I believe our primary purpose is to be a place where the gospel is preached, mm-hmm. right? And that's what we exist to do. Yeah. Can you do that without a massive church? Sure. Mm-hmm. But where, again, I start to push back a little bit is we go, hey, we just had over the 10 Christmas services we did, 600 people, and again, we can debate the decision for Christ and all that matters. Yeah. 600 people filled out a thing saying that they made a decision to say yes for Jesus. Mm-hmm. So for me, I look at that and go, at that level of scale, that's hard to do with you and I in our homes, mm-hmm. right? And mm-hmm. so I think there's a level of that where I don't think one is bad or good. Mm-hmm. I think that God can use all of the above.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that the tough part, I think generally people will say, well, are people getting plugged in to small groups? Are people getting discipled? Is there accountability for how the funds are spent? Sure. Right? And so I think there's a lot of churches that do amazing stuff. Like I'm going to have Pastor Chris Brown on from North Coast next Wednesday. I want to talk to you offline. Like, I think that's a great, this is Pastor Daniel Golding, if you're just tuning in from Rock Point Church in Gilbert, Arizona. Technically not Gilbert, it's Queen Creek. Queen Creek.
We're literally across the street.
Across the street. Yeah. So you guys can look him up, check out his church. So I think when I see pastors who, when we look at the macro, and I think there are pastors that do a good job.
Sure.
Chris Brown and North Coast, I think he said I think they're like 90% of their church is in a small 90, group. Yeah. That's crazy, right? I think of this might be a controversial one for some of you guys. Rich Wilkinson's church, right? Like, he wasn't taking a salary for the longest, and then they were, I think, only 30% of their budget was going to like facilities and buildings, but they also had a building given to them, and he's also, connected with the Kardashians and all that stuff, right? Yeah. But I just think there's also there's models where when you think of like VU Church, like, you definitely think of like amazing community work that they're doing in places like Liberty City and in places like that. And so the context of I guess my statement was like, it's not that like, oh, every dollar got to go back out, right? Yeah. It's more so like, if we know we're dealing with people that are jaded towards the evangelical industrial complex. I just gave words to something that we all kind of feel innately, right? Not I, but it's a term that's been floating around for a while. I think one of the things that could help mitigate some of that is to do more philanthropy and do more work to help people. And by the way, this is something I think Mike Todd does a killer job at.
100%.
You know what I mean? Like, I think Mike Todd crushes it at giving money to. He gave $1 million to this church, $1 million to that church. Yep. He's giving away. Like, I think that's beautiful. You know.
I think a big part of it is the church has kind of operated under the model that it's not so much like secret, but they just don't talk about a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And so people do what they do, and they fill in the blanks, right? And they fill in the gaps with what they suppose is happening. They see a pastor drive in on a car that's more than a hoopty, and they're like, oh, he's taking all the money.
Yeah.
And it's like, if people just knew, like truly, if somebody were to sit down and walk through, all of our finances are public record because we're a nonprofit. You can come in and request to see all of it. You can see salaries, you can see, and we do have a board that oversees all of that. We have a team of a separate financial team that also then submits the budget numbers, and they see everything. And I know multiple guys that are on there that are brilliant with money. They're the ones that first oversee it, then it goes to the elders for the final approval, and then that gets handed to the staff to see and run and to be dealt with. But if somebody were to sit down and understand it and see it, you would go, oh, this makes so much more sense. But the church hasn't been very forthright with it. And so the world we're moving into is going to force the church, if we're really going to go after reaching lost people and not just having sheep bounce around from different churches and getting more Christians in our church, a big part of it is going to have to be, we have to, and I'm not saying, hey, every week we just print out, dollar for dollar.
I mean, there's churches that do that too, by the way. Southern Baptist churches do that.
I don't think it's a terrible thing to have some resource on your website to go, look, just go here. You can see exactly where it is, and be much more transparent with it, because it's not as crazy as people think, right? It's not.
I think it's just we've heard the horror stories
100%.
of the rise and fall of Mars Hill, which, I'm friendly with Driscoll today, you know what I mean? But like you hear those horror stories and you hear how the funds were spent and books and budgets and trips and, you know what I mean? Like you hear those things, and so then you wonder like, well, wait a minute, should this stuff be spent with tithe money, right? Like it's a little different if it's like, hey, like we threw a concert or whatever, we threw a conference and then their money came in. I think that's where people will tend to have an issue. And I don't think there's anything wrong. I think it would be ideal to share transparently, this is what came in, this is what went out, this is, you know what I mean? This is what we spent on staffing, what we spent on building, what we spent on this. I think that's healthy. Like, would you agree?
Yeah. And again, I think most churches do some type of annual report and give that out in big chunks, right? Again, when you look at a lot of these stories, the Mike Todd, the Stephen Furtick, the Mark Driscoll, what it is young guys that started a church that were massively talented and skilled, and it just blew up to a point that I look at that and I go, man, I one of the greatest things that I'm thankful for is that I had an opportunity when we were doing stuff at the movement to just be able to pastor and grow and learn in obscurity, that I wasn't good enough, that I blew up out of nowhere, that God was smart enough to know, like, hey, bro, you need to sit in the back and just do this with nobody around for a long time and preach at young adults ministry with 4 people, because you get to develop it over a long period of time, right? Like I look at the Chuck Smith in Calvary Chapel, and it's like he's known for this thing that blew up, but they forget that this dude pastored a church of 200 people for like 20 years before it blew up. And so now you see why he was able to be so healthy, and it probably wasn't perfect. But as I look at the stories that play out over and over and over again, a lot of them have the theme of a really young, charismatic dude that started something and it just absolutely exploded. And there's thousands and thousands of people, millions and millions of dollars. And everybody, again, the part that I appreciate the most about Chris Brown is he talks about, man, people think that 2 minutes that they see me on stage, they think that that's who I am. That's not who I am. But if I'm not careful, I will begin to believe what they're saying. And I'll begin to believe that, yes, the best part of my presentation, that is who I am. This is where I should find my identity. And it's such a slippery slope, man. It's such a subtle foe that I don't think people appreciate it enough. It's a tough thing to have a skill set where you can stand in front of a couple thousand people at a time, hold their attention for 45 minutes, be funny, exegete a passage, make it applicable to their lives, make it, succinct enough, and then walk off and go, but remember, that's not about you. You can't have any type of pride. You got to be super humble. Like, dude, it's a grind.
I don't know if your brain knows the difference.
Well, and it's just such an unnatural physiological thing. Like, all of our biology is when you walk into a room and there's everybody staring at you. Through evolution, we've learned, like, hey, and I know I use the word evolution. People will probably get me for that one, but it's like you learn, this means I'm about to be attacked. Like, these people are coming for me. And so you start to have a physiological response to it. It's like it's such an unnatural thing that we've created, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. But some of the stuff we have in the church model is we have completely elevated the position of being a pastor.
Yeah.
And if you're not somebody that is naturally relational, that pursues relationships with people who aren't impressed by you, you can unintentionally become that guy that really begins to believe all the hype of what people are saying about you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good, man. And again, like when I go back to the content creator thing, I think this is one of the things that's like amazing about YouTube.
No question.
Me and you are having this conversation, and there's 553 people here right now,
man.
right? And there's probably going to be tens of thousands that watch the replay of this. And it's just a number on the screen to me.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is like, you don't really know the weight and the impact of what you do, of what I would do on the other side, right?
Yeah.
Like, like, yo, I'm from 10,000 people. This is crazy. I'm anxious. I got butterflies in my stomach, right?
Yeah, it's way different.
I got to go pee a bunch of times right before I go on stage, right? If anybody that's preached, that's me. I got to pee like 10 times. But the flip side of like this is like, it's just numbers on a screen, and I try to go out of my way to meet as many people and interact with as many people to just remind me, like, oh, these are real people being really impacted. You mentioned something else. You mentioned 20. Furtick being 28. I think Mike Todd was in his late 20s, early 30s.
Yep.
Driscoll being 20. If we see this pattern of guys in their late 20s starting these things and the bumpy roads in the process, wouldn't we then say, hey, let's all be more cautious of maybe not platform. Like, I would never attend the church of a guy in his late 20s again.
Yeah.
Like, if you're 28, 29, starting a church, I would never go to a church. I would never go to a church of a single guy. You know what I mean? I just wouldn't. I'm not saying God can't use it. That's, again, it's different, right? There's the providence of God. God can use whoever and whenever and does use a lot of things for the good. But if we know that, like, this is messy, wouldn't we then be more cautious to create guardrails for the guy that's 28 and 29?
So I think the real question is why have we continued to create the same person time and time?
Same
and
avatar.
Time again.
Yeah.
We love the story of a meteoric rise, and we also love the story of a catastrophic fall. And so I think there's an element of it where we have to ask ourselves the question, corporately, as the body of Christ, how have we created this and made this the environment where this is almost the standard? If you have any level of talent and charisma, that this thing is just going to blow up and become massive, and we love it, right? I think that's the really peculiar part, where it's so easy to point fingers at it, but it's like, well, who's attending these churches and going to these things? It's the church, right? It's the people, and we just keep creating the same cycle over and over and over again.
You remember when we were 28 years old?
Dude. Yeah, man.
Like, bro,
Yeah.
I mean, and again, me and you have pretty rough testimonies.
Yeah.
You were doing drugs, and you was out here wilding out.
Yeah,
I was out, up until 17, I had a really rough upbringing. So maybe it would have been different if we were in a church. But, like, I couldn't imagine I'm going to be 38 on Saturday, and you're 37 because you're a year younger than me, right?
I'm 34, dog.
Whoa!
I know. I'm young. Yeah.
You're 34?
That's
bro?
right. Yeah.
Gosh, I feel so old.
It's because you are.
I always thought you were like a year younger than me. I forgot you were
couple years.
4 years younger than me.
Couple.
What year did you graduate high school?
06.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's 3 years younger than me in high school years.
There you go.
In doggy years.
Yeah.
Okay. But could you imagine starting a church at 28?
No.
Like, you're 34, and it's like, wait, like, there's a lot of weight to this. Yeah. I'm 37, about to be 38. I want nothing to do with ever starting a church, right? I would love to be a part of something and just be in someone's corner as someone's just coach or cheerleader. Like, I'm totally down for that. And hey, if you need me to preach occasionally, I'm down. I don't need to get paid. Yeah. But to want to start a church at 20, in your mid-20s, bro?
Yeah. Again, I think you bring up a good point, though. I think a lot of people, what happens in ministry is you just hit the ceiling really quickly. As a talented guy in any church organization, you hit a ceiling pretty quickly. And if you don't have good leaders around that can create margin for you in that organization, which again is hard to do, you start to realize there's not a ton of options for me, right? And most church plants, a lot of them, obviously they feel the prompting of God, but a big part of the prompting of God is like, well, I'm at a ceiling here, so how do I go and get out of the ceiling? I go and start my own thing. And so I think part of it is, hey, we as the church can share the pulpit. Part of what I love about our senior pastor is he's very, he's not holding on to the pulpit like it's his thing to do. He really has grown. The wild part about our church is for the last 5 or 6 years, we've been like the fastest growing church in Arizona, one of the fastest in the country, but we've also been a church for 22 years, right? And for 15 of those years, I wasn't even a part of it, but our senior pastor was preaching week in and week out, right? And kind of leading a church of 1,000 to 1,500 people in a level of obscurity. And so out of that, there was this healthy foundation that was built that I think we're now reaping the harvest of. But not everybody gets to do that. And, you know, how the providence of God works and all of that is a wild thing. Because at 28, you're just so ambitious.
You are, man. You are ambitious and you lack wisdom. You
don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
You know, it's literally the book of Ecclesiastes played out.
If you're a pastor in here, I want to hear from you guys. Like, some of you guys said you were lead pastoring at 25? Like, you planted a church at 25? I'm not saying there's not exceptions to the rule. I'm just saying, man, Jesus didn't start his earthly ministry till he was 30, and he was Jesus, bro. Right. You know, like, this is Jesus. And you guys are starting churches at 25 and like rocking out for real? High school graduate, not go to college. But Jonas, you are the head pastor. I'm not talking about youth ministry. I'm not talking about young adults ministry. I'm not talking about, right? I'm talking about you started your own church at 25. Please confirm that. That's wild to me. And how is it going? How is it going? You know, because here's my thing. Head pastor at 27. Okay. Yeah, that's wild. Are you under covering a denominational? Like, are you SBC? Are you right? Did you get sent out, or did you just self-proclaim yourself to be a lead pastor of a church and just go?
Again, I think with good guardrails in place, with real accountability. Yeah. But the hard part, it's so easy to start something and just go out on your own, have some loose affiliation. Yeah. And there's a lot of organizations out there that are willing to throw money at church planters.
Oh,
too.
Yeah. You know, well, so, church rejuvenation now is a thing too. Yeah. Go in and take over a church, take their building, their real estate, and redo it all. I think God can use that. I just think it's the exception and not the rule. And I think when you guys are like, I'm 25, I'm going to be a head pastor, I just go, all right, man.
Well, so the flip side right now too, the other side of the coin, just to kind of play devil's advocate, is we're also about to see. Right, there's all of these baby boomer senior pastors right now that got saved in the Jesus movement that are all now getting ready to retire. And a lot of them have built pretty decently sized churches.
Oh, yeah.
And there's no succession plans in place.
And that's sad.
And there's no pastors that are running to take over these churches.
And I just go, what kind of pastor are you if there's no one you're training up underneath you to take this thing over?
Dude, it's way more common than you would.
Isn't that sad, though?
It's heartbreaking. Yeah, it's
like if you want to retire at 60, 65, even 70, and you have no young bucks around you that you've been pouring into for the past couple years, that maybe you've sponsored to send them to Bible college or seminary, like, I don't know, man. That just sounds sad.
It's all too common because, again, it's the tension between the main communicator and the secondary communicator. Again, right now, I'm 20 years younger, essentially, than our senior pastor. And so there could be an element of it from his standpoint, and he's not at all. Like, our senior pastor is amazing. But there could be a thing of, like, he gets envious or weird with me. I mean, that's how it was at the church out here, where it's like, oh, you're too good. And people like you. They like you more than me. And so, that used to happen at the church we were on staff at together, where he would then go, why do you want my job? I'm like, what are you talking about, bro? Like, I just preached when you told me to preach. Like, what, you want me to suck? And so there becomes almost this, I can't set you up for success because it means my demise.
Yeah, my job's in jeopardy.
So it takes a really secure leader to go, this isn't mine. This is something that God has asked me to steward. Yeah. And I know that at some point there'll be a transition, and I want to think about that now. And we're, our senior pastor is 10 years away or so from retirement, and he's already talking through potential succession plans and talking through what that would look like. And I think it's healthy, but it takes a really secure leader to do that.
Yeah. I think the tough part is when it comes to pastors and ministry in general. I think most people don't have the slightest clue of what it takes and how hard it is,
100%.
physically, mentally, spiritually. And then when pastors are compensated nicely, which I think they should be, I think then people feel a way, and it's like you have not the slightest clue of what a pastor goes through on the day-to-day basis. Can you give us some of just that backstory of like just the pressures of like one kind of some of the things you've experienced in ministry, and then maybe some of the stuff you're going through in your current role as a pastor at a mega church?
Yeah, man. Again, no matter what you do, you don't make enough money for some people. You make too much money for other people. And you have this really weird role that nobody really understands. They see you one day out of the week and assume that 35-minute message, that's the totality of your job. And the thing that I come down to is, man, I know and live life with lots and lots and lots of pastors. 99% of them are the most amazing people that I've ever met that are working extra jobs to be able to pay the bills, that are trying to do everything they can to love and shepherd the congregation that God has given them, to love and lead their families really well. Most of them are trying to figure it out and just go, man, I feel inadequate to do this. I don't know, how best to do this. I don't know what decisions to make, because you've got to be a combination of a great communicator. You've got to be a visionary. You've got to be able to lead your staff. You've got to make strategic decisions. And there's almost this culture that's being created because of, I think, of a lot of different factors that almost feels like you also have to do this alone. Just go into your private prayer closet, come out, be brilliant, give us your messages.
Give us your weekly TED Talk.
That's right. Just wow us, man. We just want to be around God's anointed. And the truth is there are a handful of those guys in the country that are just bonkers, man. But most of the pastors that I know, people, if they got to spend a week with them and walk around and just see how they live their life, they'd go, man, these are really good dudes that are trying, guys and girls that are trying to do their best to love the people that God has put in front of them. And so all these wild, outlandish stories and people paint with these broad strokes, I'm like, it's because you don't know these people, right? And most of them are doing everything they can to try to just get through. Are there some bad apples in it? Yes. It's like every other profession out there. There's always going to be bad apples. But most of them are incredibly faithful people that have sacrificed a lot to be here, that could go probably make a lot more money in other industries, that could go out and, do other stuff. But God has called them to this vocation. And it's one of those things, man, where it's like when you've been called to ministry, it's the most amazing and at times frustrating thing in the world.
And to be clear, specifically with you, like you were a top sales guy just recently, and you were making double, right? Double than what you were making as a pastor when you were
probably
doing
3 or 4 times.
Three or four times what you're making as a pastor now. So because it's such a unicorn of a skill set, like to be able to communicate, to be able to teach, to be able to persuade, to be able to know a little bit of tech, to be able to lead and manage people. It's such a unicorn of a skill set. So I've always been very adamant, and even I've been intentionally platforming more pastors and showing more pastors so that, like, hey, if they're in Arizona, they can go check you out, or they can go check out Trey Van Camp, right? We talk about the movement here a lot, Rhythm Church here a lot, right? So people can get plugged into churches, because I think it's super important. I think there's a misconception that we're kind of touching on it earlier, right? Like some people were like, the church just has to feed the widow and the orphan, right? And I'm going through this series on church history, which is actually really, really, really cool. I'm going to send you the link. Pastor Mike Winger shared it. I know my brother Truther has seen it. And I'm in the early church phase. So this is right after the apostolic church. And what's interesting is for the first 100 to 150 years, the church didn't meet in buildings. They were home churches, right? And so when you hear about feeding the widow and the orphan, I'm not sure that was necessarily coming from like a local ecclesia standpoint, as much as that was coming from people pulling their resources in the local ecclesia to take care of people, right, and to do good and to do charity. But the moment they could meet in local in buildings, they did. And that was until I believe about the year 150-ish. And then at the time, Christianity was still like only 2 or 3% of Rome. And then I think at the year 300, it was like 10%. And then after Constantine, it was like 50%. And so we see this pattern within church history where they didn't necessarily take up like tithes and offerings the way we do, right? But when they could meet in buildings, they met in buildings immediately. So I say all that to say, like, it's not a dichotomy of like small church, big church, right?
Sure.
Like, give all the money to the poor, give no money to the poor. Like, I think it's and both. You know, one of the things Trizzle was just on, and I showed you the video we got with Trizzle that's going viral on Instagram right now.
Yeah.
And I got a clip coming out with him about how his church, I forgot what they're called, but they're in Orange County, and he was talking about how they have a huge initiative to get members to foster. And so they have been fostering heavy, and a lot of families do that. And so they have I believe a 1-year-old now that's been with them since he was like 2 weeks. He was like abandoned, and they took him in, you know? And so like, I think that sort of stuff isn't necessarily like, does the church have an orphanage in the back? You know what I mean? But like, is the church equipping people to be the hands and feet of Jesus?
Yeah. No, 100%, man. And I think that's, again, you look at Francis Chan is walking through a lot of this right now, right? You look at a guy that's wildly talented and grew this massive thing, and then really started to feel like, oh, this big church thing is bad and we should go back to small church. Well, the issue he's running into now is, okay, you do them in homes. Well, what happens when you still have the wildly talented guy leading the Bible study that everybody wants to hear his opinion and how he breaks it down and his, commentary. And all
Some
that
people
stuff.
just got a different grace over their life, man.
Dude, and so what they started to do, though, I don't know if you've seen this, but they have all these home churches and house church leaders and all this stuff. But everybody still is like, well, we want to do at least once a month gatherings, with Francis, and we do some kind of like collective worship experience. And so now they're back getting these big buildings because they're outgrowing all of this stuff. And so there's a part of it where I'm like, man, I don't think it's big or small, that's good or bad. I think in there, it's how do we make it healthy? I think healthy is the goal, healthy is the thing. And I think those stories, like your buddy's church you're talking about, those are the stories most people don't hear. Like, Christians give more money to nonprofits than anybody else. They adopt more children than anybody else. Our church, same thing. Arizona, our foster care system is an absolute nightmare. 5 or 6 years ago, our church said, hey, we can make a difference. We have the resources. We have the amount of people. Let's get together the local experts and let's go after this thing. And so we now foster inside of our church. Families foster hundreds of these kids. We do an initiative every year that goes, hey, everybody in this church can support a foster kid. Doesn't mean they don't have to live with you. If you can't foster them in your home, then you can support the parents that do and come do a babysitting thing to where these parents can have a night out. And if you can't do that, you can give some money, right? And so we do, and we rally around the foster kids in our community. And I think those stories aren't told because they're not sexy. They're not, they don't sell headlines. It's just, oh yeah, the local church takes care of the foster kids. Awesome.
Right. Yeah. Because if it bleeds, it leads. And so the most
100%.
sensational, wild, over the top stories are going to be the ones that lead, and get people to click. What do you think? I even just saw it in the chat earlier. What do you think of this notion? And I find it really frustrating, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Like, the early church, the apostolic church, and through the early church, really through Constantine, right? Like, we're in a era where being a Christian was illegal, right?
It was dangerous.
It was dangerous from the Jewish side and from the Roman side. Because when you said, we follow Lord Jesus, you were basically saying Caesar isn't our Lord, right? And there was a lot of overlap. So we're looking at snapshots in Scripture through times in history where there was massive oppression and persecution for the church. Yet today we don't have that. And some people still want to go back to this weird, bizarre, romanticized martyrdom that you don't have to go. Like, the martyrs went through that, so you don't have to, right? We're in a time where we can leverage all the opportunity we have being in a country that is friendly to our faith, maybe not affirming of our faith, but they're like, for the most part, America's, thank God, still like, all right, like, y'all weirdo Christians do your thing, right? Generally speaking, we're in a time where we could do that, where we're not ostracized from working in certain industries. We're not stoned if we profess Jesus over President Biden, right? And so it's like, but there's still this weird, bizarre tension with certain people, and I would call it a flat out poverty gospel. Like, that's what I think it is. What do you make of that with some people that just have this infatuation with, like, Paul got stoned and we get money? Like, what do you think of that?
Yeah, again, I think that part of the bizarre thing that is happening in our country is Christianity has done better and thrived and when there has been a level of oppression, right? And so as the church has become more collectively like our expression as a country, and there's been an incorporation of the Christian values into just everyday worldly culture, there's been, again, I think part of what people are trying to express is there used to be a cost to following Jesus, right? There's not really a cost anymore in that you go to a lot of, and part of my challenge coming from a San Diego context, which was a lot of non-church people that I was interacting with, especially in students, and then going to Phoenix where it should be part of the Bible Belt, right? Like it's a very churched area. I was like, oh, my eyes were open to all these people that were just cultural Christians, right? In that context, as somebody who wasn't Christian growing up, who got saved, I realized like, oh, this changes everything. Like you become a new person, have new desires, and your life should look different, right? So the concept that exists in our country, I think to a lot of those people are like, well, this is the unnatural byproduct if there isn't a level of martyrdom. Now, the flip side is like, well, what do you want us to do? Have the threat of being killed? I think that there's ways that the church can call people to a standard and remember that what we're not asked to do is just easy believism, right? Of like, hey, just throw your hand up. Yep, you've accepted Jesus. And I think that is the knock against the big church is like, even for us in the Christmas Eve services, am I excited that 600 people threw their hand up, filled out some form saying they accepted Jesus? Yes, but if it stops there, I think that's a massive L. And we can't just celebrate that and cheer and go, look at what we did, this is amazing. Right. And then go, that is our victory. Because it's like, well, that's where our cultural Christianity has always stopped. It's just throw your hand up and it doesn't actually cost you anything. And it's like, that is so antithetical to what Jesus said. Like, this is going to be the most expensive endeavor you've ever entered into. You and I don't get to dip our toes in the water of faith. This is an all or nothing kind of thing. Like, it should look like the way you love your mother and father is like horrendous compared to what you're doing. Like, it should cost you something. Like, this is... people should look at you. And again, for us, I think the cost is that your friends might look at you and go, oh, why are you not drinking? Like, well, because, God's changed my desires and I don't really want to. Oh, that'd be so weird to say that. I think that's the cost for us living in the culture today. So it's like, again, I don't...
It's not persecution, though. I mean, I guess it is to a certain degree, but like, is that really...
Again, there's also people that are like, we're so persecuted. And it's like, really? Like, there was people that were literally actually stoned. But I think what is happening, and again, when you look at where the church is thriving today, I think that there's a massive desire for, in young people, to be called back to what the church was always supposed to be. This countercultural, all or nothing, this changes everything, completely new way of living, not just a self-improvement 2.0 that Jesus makes you a slightly better version of yourself. I think I look at that and I go, man, the harvest is plentiful, right? With a real gospel message. I think as somebody who's in church, it really excites me.
Yeah, and I also think like, what if we get the opportunity to not be persecuted so that we can help others who are persecuted in real places where there's persecution, with the real underground church in China or in North Korea or in Pakistan or in Iran, right? Like, where like being a Christian is literally a threat towards your life. What if the people here can actually support the missions that are happening there? Right?
I think that's the opportunity that's available to us as the American church, right? But it's been so hard because most of the message for people has been that it's just, Jesus is here to make you a slightly better version of you. And that better version of you means more money and more income and a better house and kids that, listen to you and don't talk back. And I just don't see that in the scriptures.
Because it's neither, right? Like, it's not like Jesus is here just to make everything better. And it's also not like, hey, if you follow Jesus in America, you're going to get martyred.
100%.
You know what I mean? Like, it's neither of those things. Let's talk about this. Tell me, at what point, with regards to everything we've talked about, like, at what point does doctrine matter? At what point do we say foul or call your own foul? At what point does the line get crossed and something that's said publicly deserves a public response. Where do you think that line is with celebrity pastors, with any pastor really?
Again, I think that it is something that is massive. I think that we're living in a time where I would argue doctrine and theology matter more than they almost ever have because the waters have become so muddied. And I think that's the part that is interesting because Mike Todd has had moments where he's done kind of silly stuff and then come back and apologize for it. Remember the whole like spitting on the dude's eyes and all that.
Oh yeah.
So
that was his brother.
The flip side of it is where part of, you know, I think through the practicality of it, you know, like, okay, that's how you start the next week is go, hey, I just want to spend a couple minutes and walk through this thing that I said. Well, what about people in the audience that weren't there? You've got to set that context up. So I think there's a logistics part of it that I go, okay, maybe it's something you post on social media or something. But I think if you do make a public mistake like that, and it genuinely is a mistake, like things that you're like, oh, I thought it said that, or I quoted the wrong scripture, or again, I think sometimes the danger is these guys are just trying to get something that's people are going to share and like. And I think, man, for my advice to a lot of the young pastors that I'm around is, dude, just preach a book in the Bible.
Come on.
Like,
this is Mike Winger said the same thing.
Yeah, man, literally. Like, and I don't say it to go, hey, because I did it, that means it's successful and you should just do what we did. But that young adults ministry, again, I knew as I got around the context of young adults in the Phoenix area, I was like, oh, I've got to bring up the Bible literacy. Part of how I really show the beauty and the magnitude of who Jesus is I've got to get them to fall in love with Scripture. So how do I do that? Well, I can't force them to read their Bible during the week, but I can just teach them through the Bible. And so I taught the book of Genesis for like 16 weeks, you know, and we just walked chapter through chapter, and we'd skip some of the stuff where there was, you know, a lot of the genealogies and all that. But for the most part, we just taught books of the Bible. And part of what I felt was my burden was to help them fall in love with the Scriptures and to also dumb it down to a point where they could go, oh, you can do this too. Of like, hey, when you see these words, this is what this means, right? And to help them practically figure out how they can do this on their own. We're rolling out a whole thing in this year coming up where, you know, that's our big goal is how do I get them in Scripture more? I've got to get them to fall in love with the Word of God because otherwise what happens is every one of these ministries is when the guy that's there that everybody likes, the thing blows up and there's a big crowd and we pat ourselves on the back and say that that's a success. And I just go, I don't know if it is, right? Because the moment you leave, it all goes away. Yeah. And then you ask the question, and I've been in ministry long enough where I'm watching a lot of the kids that were in my youth ministry when that's what meant so much to me was the clickable, tweetable things that I said. And I spent so much time worried about that I'm like, man, I forgot to help these kids fall in love with God's Word and to leave them with something that when I'm not there, that can carry them through. And a lot of them are now, you know, and again, it's not that we're God and that they're in a process, but I ask myself a lot, man, what have we left these students with?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I have a question for you, and then I have one last question for you, and then you could ask me any question or give me any critique about what I do on the channel, because you keep it loosely. Yeah. And then we're gonna go to their questions.
Love it.
Okay. Before that, let's take a quick break. Guys, we got a brand new song out. I'm going to play that for you while I use the restroom. Hey, you may not know I make music, but I have a brand new song that just came out. Here's a quick preview.
I went from being a porn addict to sharing the gospel with a porn actress who was criticized for being low status by the same OnlyFans who treat us so lavish. I'm confused.
I swear y'all thought he did doing podcasts, hot takes. He still can rap.
Now, this is my first song that I've released in over a year, so I need you to go to Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you consume music and stream Too Soon right now. Add it to your favorite playlist, share it with a friend. So hit the link in the description or go to RuslanToTheMoon.com to stream Too Soon now. I'll see you over there.
Ooh, ooh. Oh, they got me with the dramatics. You knew that a moment cannot be static too soon.
Ruslan.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am back with Pastor Daniel Goulding.
That's a capital P pastor too.
Capital P pastor. He ain't no youth. He ain't no young buck out here. He ain't no youth pastor. He's no young adults pastor. He's the real thing, ladies and gentlemen.
That's right.
Pastor Daniel Goulding from Rock Point in Gilbert, Arizona. One of the fastest growing churches in the country, one of the fastest growing churches in Arizona. If you guys are in that area, check him out. How many times a year do you preach?
So it's typically about 15 to 16. Yeah, a little over
That's a
once a
lot.
month.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing. There's another question I had for you, but I lost. Oh, we were gonna go to their questions. If I think of it, you could ask. But yeah, anyway, my question for you, I was gonna see if you had any questions for me, and or do you have any critique for what I do here?
No, man. Again, I think that what you do I wouldn't say being critical of the church, but asking some of the questions that need to be asked, I think is a really good thing. I think the church needs it. I think that that's where we can stay really healthy, is to go, we shouldn't be defensive. We should be able to be asked hard questions. We should be able to raise our hand and go, hey, I made a mistake. I thought this was going to go well. This didn't. So I think it's really healthy. The thing that I've always challenged you with is playing devil's advocate is I think sometimes it's really easy to solve these really complex problems in simple statements that in the practicality and in the flesh are much more nuanced and but again, man, you and I have those conversations. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think you do a good job of trying to balance it. I love what you've done. The really funny part for me is being in Arizona, a lot of my young adults and people at our church watch this channel because a lot of them are trying to figure out this church thing. And there aren't a lot of voices that haven't completely broken away from the faith with how far away they've moved from it, that are still Christians who love Jesus, who believe in the Bible, who are solid theologically, but also call out the dumb stuff that the church does that needs to be called out, that I think is allowing the church to continue to thrive. And for young people to realize not all of us are these talking heads. There's a lot of people who think critically about a lot of these problems and are working actively to solve them. And so I think part of what you're doing is, and I think part of why the growth you've seen is because there's a need for this voice, and people are hungry to go. It can't be that we just walk away from all of it and completely break it all down, and then what's left us with nothing. And so I think that's the part that I appreciate the most about what you're trying to do in this.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think I enjoy. One of the things I've been enjoying more and more is reevaluating and figuring out all the reasons that I am still a follower of Jesus.
That's
I
right.
am still in love with Jesus, right? Like it's such an interesting thing that like I could sit and listen to the most staunch skeptics debate Christians and all, and I walk away from those like so reinvigorated.
Yeah.
Like, man, like Jesus is good. You know, this Jesus, he really is the real deal. You know,
Yeah.
he really is who he says he is. Before we get into their questions, guys, if you got a question, just write it all capitals questions. I'm here with Pastor Daniel Golding from Rock Point Church in Gilbert, Arizona. Write the word question first, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark some. I see them as they're coming in. I saw a couple good ones. If you guys could re-ask them, we'll mark them. We'll go through a couple questions. Take us back. This is kind of more... This is low-key what gave me my YouTube career launch. I don't know if I ever said this to you. When I was working with adults with developmental disabilities, you were like, hey, these video announcements are blowing up right now. And, you know, if you could figure out how to do these, we can get you a job at the church. You know? And you and me made a mock video announcement on my Canon T2i, I think T2i, T2 III or something like that. It was like a $300 camera I got on Craigslist.
Yep.
And on a version of Final Cut Pro X that was Daniel Rothamel's. You remember Daniel Rothamel's? I had his login.
Other Daniel.
And I had all I had done up to that point just edited my own music videos and like some like little theatrical stuff. And so take us back, because that was such a pivotal time, because had I not done that, I wouldn't have learned broadcasting and streaming. And had I not learned broadcasting and streaming, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. So take us back to that, just that where we were at that time, and tell that story.
Well, the crazier part is, even a step back from that, is there was that Bible study that we were all in. There's, I don't know, 8 to 10 of us that met every week religiously for years and years and years. And we used to weigh ourselves, and we would work out before, and we had goals every year, financial and personal and family and ministry. And the awesome part is to see the success.
We would play basketball and cuss each other
That's
out.
right. Yeah.
And then sit down and be fuming.
You remember the one
Who's
time-
gonna open with prayer?
That's right. There was one time that we weren't playing basketball and we played Call of Duty or something. It was when you and Monette were living with your mom on the other side.
Yep.
And Omar literally started cussing people out, and it got heated, bro. And you had to like shut it down because we have to transition to pray and do Bible study. And but the awesome part with that group is it was a bunch of dudes who were like, man, we believe this thing enough to go. We understand the biggest gap between what we want to experience and the things we want to see God do in our life is really the accountability and people pushing us to get there. And I think the awesome part is what has come of that group. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And it's rad to see all that God has done through a bunch of dudes that faithfully.
I mean, who was all in that group? Me, you, Belief. Michael, who's booming on TikTok, and he's chefing up. Who else was in that group? I'm trying to remember.
Brian.
Yeah.
Both Brians.
Yep. Robert Smith, who's actually at Tim Ross's church, or the church that Tim Ross just passed on. He actually had a succession plan because of podcasting. So Robert was actually attending his church. That church blew up into a mega church. We had a kind of a all-star cast, man, back in the day.
It was a crew. All of us at one point were, serving in pretty high levels of ministry. Doing all kinds of stuff, man. And so the awesome part is I do remember all that with the video announcements, and the church was trying to figure out all these transitions, and the people that did announcements were just terrible. And it's like, man, how do we just make this a video segment so we can pre-edit it and get all the awkward stuff out of it? And somehow we finessed you a job to do that. And and a lot of that was at the same time I got into ministry because you basically forced me to do it. I spoke and said, hey, I feel like I'm supposed to go into ministry. And then you would throw spoken word events.
Just make you
and
preach.
You're like, yo, you're going to get up there and preach. And I'm like, and do what? You're like, just tell them your testimony, bro. And I was like, oh my gosh, man, I was terrified. But had that not have happened, I probably wouldn't be in ministry today. So
we would do those events. You would tell your testimony, and then we started the King Stream Live,
100%.
And you were preaching at that, and so man, that was interesting. But let's jump into some of these questions, guys. I've marked a bunch of questions. If you can, if I miss your question, just ask it again. I'm not going to answer all these because some of you guys are asking some goofy questions, okay? But I'm going to do my best to answer all of them. Lugo Ortiz says, when should pastoral finances should be looked into if the pastor's income is strictly from the church? When should pastoral finances should be looked into if the pastor's income is strictly from the church? When? I don't know.
Yeah, so I think what he's trying to ask is at what point should the pastor's finances be looked into if their income is strictly from the church? Number one, I would say that biblically, pastor's income should be from the church, right? That's what Paul makes.
A worker's worth his wages.
That's right. That's what Paul makes an argument for, right? He says multiple times that we should take care of the people that are in ministry. Actually says we should give them a double, a double fold or whatever the phrasing is.
Double portion.
Double portion. So I think pastors should be able to make enough money to where they don't have to go and work an extra job because of how much work it is to run a church, run a staff, do all of the things. Now, should that come with no restrictions and no limitations and no accountability? 1,000% no, not at all. And there's actually a lot of, because yes, we're a church, but we're also, from a tax standpoint, a nonprofit. And there's a lot of governing principles of how that nonprofit has to be run. You have to have a board. That board has to have justification for, okay, Ruslan, you're now our senior pastor. I can't just pay you whatever you want. I have to do an analysis of the area we live in. I have to go, okay, these other senior pastors that are relatively our size with similar ministry budgets, they make X, therefore you can only make X. And the IRS gives you a 10% margin, so I can go up or down on that about 10%. Outside of that, you're in illegal tax categories that if the IRS were to look in on it, somebody were to call them, you would literally be committing tax fraud.
Wow.
So that said, they're
not just winging it. They're not just write them a check.
And are there unhealthy examples that we've been a part of?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But most churches, you get behind the curtains and see it, dude, most of these pastors are living on money that most people would just be like, man, that's crazy. Like it's, again, most of these people have postgraduate degrees. They've been doing these jobs for 15 to 20 years. They're at the peak of their normal income potential, right? Mid 40s, late 40s, early 50s. and they're making next to nothing. So I think that we shouldn't be afraid of the analysis, but I think people should also, realize, hey, most pastors that you interact with, they're not the guys flying around on jets.
Yeah.
That is 0.0001% of the pastors that are out there.
Yeah. And yes, Paul was making tents, but Paul was also a traveling apostle planting churches. And when he wrote that, he was throwing it in their face almost.
Literally.
He was like, man,
you guys should have taken
you
care
should
of
have
me.
taken care of me.
Yeah,
I could have brought a wife like Peter did and the other apostles did, but I just went above and beyond because I didn't want to be a burden on you.
Yeah.
Right. So Paul was pointing to the exception to the rule, not the rule.
Yeah.
In my opinion, we know a lot of pastors who work second jobs, sometimes third jobs.
Yeah.
In my opinion, I think a pastor should be at the very least be able to do simple things like buy a home. You know what I mean?
Okay,
Like,
so perfect example. You're living in San Diego, right? Where I'm from too. You move into some of these cities, Carlsbad, for example. Most pastors I know that work at churches in Carlsbad cannot live in the city that they pastor in because it's just too expensive, right? And so on paper, if you see their salary number, people could freak out. But then it's like, well, most of them can't even afford to live in the area that they live in, And so, and I also think that the challenge is on both sides of the fence, because I know a lot of pastors that are really successful outside of the church and have their own businesses, don't take money from the church, and people assume that all their money comes from the church. I think even a lot of the guys that have boats and planes and all of that stuff, a lot of them have really successful side businesses and hustles and platforms. And I don't necessarily think that's an evil thing.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, let's go through some more of these. He said, question, I visited many mega churches and I've always felt that they have been more like a business than feeling like home. Yeah. Have you tried to navigate your church and making it feel inclusive?
Yeah, that's always, I would say, the number one struggle you face, right? And so part of what we do very intentionally, like Chris Brown and North Coast, is you have to find a place where you get into a small group. We always say that in rows you can learn, but it's in circles that we're discipled.
That's good.
It's in circles that we're transformed.
Yeah.
And so we have to be really intentional as large churches to figure out ways to get people in smaller rooms to where they're known. And for us, again, where we differ a little bit from North Coast is all small groups. And I love it, and it's a great model, and they're phenomenal. But for us, we go, well, there's other opportunities. Like for me, where I got connected before our Bible study was serving in high school ministry, right? So serving is an incredible area to get into a group of people where you're known. But we also do push small groups. We do new members things. And so we're always trying to create opportunities to get to know people. And so it's in our messaging, it's in everything we do, is to understand, hey, it's really easy to get lost in this crowd. And as consumeristic Christians, it's easy to just sit there and, hang out.
Yeah, that's good. Guys, here's something we don't do here. Even in any critique I have of any pastors I may disagree with and not be fans of, we don't presume people's motives. Like you're not a mind reader. So somebody was like, money hungry. How do you know?
Yeah.
What do you know about any of these guys? Like, stop with the motive reading. Like we could address specific actions or specific things that were said that were an error. We're not going to play that game. You play that game here, you're just going to get banned. You don't know what you don't know, so don't presume to be a mind reader and think you have it all figured out. Because you're just crossing the line there, and that's not even a good faith conversation. So let's not do that in the chat, please. Pastors are called to shepherd people. How much regular, meaningful interaction do you have with the lay members of the church? That's a great question.
Yeah. This is actually, ironically, a question you and I have gone back and forth with quite a bit. So where I would push back, or the question I would ask to the person asking that question is, well, at what point does the pastor stop being the primary person to interact with people in their church? Because I would argue if the church is more than 15 people, you're not going to be able to personally disciple all of them.
Absolutely.
You can't get coffee with them. You can't know them enough.
Yes.
So we've just now said, okay, the bar where a pastor has to put systems in place is 15 to 20 people, right? And so if you have to be the guy that has to be everybody's quote unquote pastor, that you're always the person that does everything with them and walks through, you just have to lead things that are really small. And I think that's okay. I think that's a small group.
Having a home church or
Have
whatever.
a home group, rad. Like it's not a knock against it. But at some point, you have to have systems where I like what they're asking is that, hey, there still has to be intentional discipleship. And where those senior pastors or just pastors in general get into dangerous territory is they never interact with anybody. They're in the green room. They're isolated.
That's good.
Security actually kind of keeps them by themselves. They come and go. They have designated parking spots.
Can't make eye contact with them.
No, literally. They're not in the lobby.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that those are, as I look at, okay, how do I find a place that's healthy? Is there a place that I can get plugged in? Is there places that I can serve?
Yes.
Is the gospel faithfully preached? Is scripture actually exegeted well? And is this something where they're doing a good job stewarding what God has given them? And is there a place that I can get plugged in? Now, for pastors that are listening to this, I would say, hey, there should be people that are in your life, and you have to be the one that's really intentional about this. We have a home group at our house on Wednesdays. There's only one group of the 9 couples that are a part of that is actually on staff. Everybody else, they're not.
So you pastor, you lead a small group in your home, and 9 couples attend there.
Yeah.
So you're personally shepherding at least 18 people.
And a lot of them, all of them, we hand selected to invite into our home group. It's like my daughter's friends from school. It's her parents. We invited them. A couple that literally randomly walked up to me and asked me to do their wedding. That I've known for probably 6 months now. We've asked them to be a part of it. But it's all these people that don't really know us, and we can just be humans. And we've been very intentional from the beginning to just go, look, I know we're going to listen to my messages and we'll be at a church that I work at. But for this, like, this is just us, and we're just people. And, you know.
Is it weird when you're going over your Sunday morning message in your life group?
Or somebody will say something like that they think is really impressive that I said or something. And then my wife is sitting there like, this guy's an idiot. And, you know, I don't like him.
Yeah, that's good. So to answer your question, he pastors on average 9 couples that are in his home regularly, which I think is amazing.
And that's just the small group people, right? You talk about the staff that directly reports to me. You talk about the leaders that directly report to me. Like there's a lot of people that I have to be intentional in developing. And same with our senior pastor. Our senior pastor probably with lay people in the church, this might be something that would make people upset. He probably doesn't disciple many, maybe 1 or 2 people that just are in the church. But it's because he has a staff of 100 people
that he's meeting with.
That there's key people in that he knows, okay, this is what was instructed to Moses as he was leading the people through the desert. It's like, you need some systems, bro. Like, you need to put in some system and begin to get leaders that can lead leaders.
Yeah, that's good. And so guys, if you don't like that, don't go to a megachurch.
And it's not for everybody.
Yeah, it's not for everybody. Like, just don't go to a megachurch.
That's
this
right.
is a specific thing that they're doing. And if you don't like it, like, I think the question becomes when you start saying things like, well, that's not the way church is supposed to be done. That's you're conflating preference with, is God in something?
Yeah.
That's kind of wild.
Yeah.
Like, and it's very arrogant to like, I have the monopoly on how it always has to be done. When the reality is, bro, God can move through big churches, small groups, house churches, all those different things. And so just be careful with that, because that could also get into a soteriology question of like, you can't get saved at that church. Or if that church was truly saved, they would dissolve, shut the doors, and go into homes. Like, who told you? Like, what?
Based on what? Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, are pastors more and more attracted by ecumenism? I think it means ecumenism. I always miss that word. And heresies for the sake of unity. Ecumenicism, I think is the word. Ecumenical. It just means like working cross-denominationally, working across different. Because there's people that'll say ecumenical in the sense of like, hey, we're going to do some stuff with Pentecostals, and we're going to do some stuff with other people. Then there's people that'll say, we're going to do some stuff with Catholics. We're going to do some stuff with, and then you can go way outside the lines of like, Mormons are in, and Muslims are in, and everybody's in.
For the sake of unity.
Just for the sake of unity. So I think we have to be careful with that word. Like, I personally have and will do certain things with certain Catholics on certain issues.
Sure.
Right? Not going to lean on them for soteriology and how to be saved.
Yeah.
Right? Well, when it comes to like, hey, we're going to talk about the unborn.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
they're crushing it on that, bro.
Yeah.
If we're going to talk about fostering, but when you get into like that, so I think it depends on what you're talking about. I don't know if you have any specific things, or like oneness Pentecostals. Like I'm probably not doing anything with a oneness Pentecostal. When I'm preaching at a oneness Pentecostal church, I'm not going out to a oneness Pentecostal church. I would probably draw the line there, or a Mormon church, or Jehovah's Witness church. Not that they're banging on my door to come and speak it there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Again, I think the other side of the coin that I would argue is I tend to err on the side of more going, hey, we do have way more in common than we do apart, right? Like, let's take the close-handed things that we don't move on, we refuse to disagree about.
Yes.
And if we're in alignment there, all this open-handed stuff, man, if you want to pray in tongues, tear it up. Like, that stuff doesn't freak me out.
Well, I think the issue is now we don't know what open-handed and close-handed is. And so if you're in a specific camp, then you think everything is close-handed. You think how your view of tongues is close-handed. You think your view of, right? And so I think that's the dangerous part is we've lost sight of what is open-handed and close-handed.
Yeah, I think it just comes down to teaching good theology again.
Yeah. All right. Anderson said, what would you say would be the best, thank you for the super chat, by the way, best way to have accountability in a megachurch setting for the pastor?
Yeah. The danger is, and this is the part that I don't love about the model, is it's very dependent on the senior pastor. Because you get to, as the guy that creates the nonprofit, you get to create the bylaws, you get to create all of it. And so if you're not self-aware enough to go outside of the grace of God, there go I, and I'm capable of absolutely anything. And so from the very beginning of this thing, I'm going to set it up with checks and balances. I'm going to set it up with accountability.
Elder boards, board of advisors,
outside
all that.
people that, like, if the senior pastor doesn't do that, you better believe they can create a system, intentionally or not, that creates them being a literal dictator in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And so for me, what I didn't know getting into ministry, as somebody that wasn't in church, was like, hey, there's some questions you should ask ahead of time before you work at a church of like, can I meet with the elders? Not like, oh, do we have elders? And they go, yep, for sure. You're like, awesome, rad. Like, let's move on.
Yeah.
Step 2, right? And I got to see close hand that played out over 15 years and what it leads to and just the absolute destruction. And I was like, oh, if I just asked some of these questions ahead of time, I could have seen the pitfalls that were there. Because where there is smoke, there is always fire. And it's only a matter of time until it comes out. So how can there be accountability for these pastors? Unfortunately, for most of them, they have to be smart enough to build it in. And so I would, if I was going to attend a church, if I was going to really faithfully be a part of it, those are the questions I would ask. Yeah,
that's good. Guys, we're going to try to get through as many as we can. We'll prioritize whatever super chats come in. When is your heart out, Daniel? I know you have family and all kinds of stuff.
Man, I'm good. I'm hanging
chilling?
out. So
okay.
You tell me to leave.
Okay. Our past. Oh, we already did this one. Sorry. Let me get rid of that. I'm gonna work in some other people. Questions? Can you suggest a church in Pensacola, Florida? Area? You know anybody in Pensacola?
You reading English is like my favorite
It's my second
thing,
language.
Bro.
What do you want from me?
I think, isn't Voo Church around there?
Voo Church is in Miami. I don't know how far that is from Pensacola.
I wish I knew more, man.
Yeah, I don't know anyone out there, but if you're in South Florida, Voo Church is cool. There's a lot of churches that are in that area that are, I think, solid. Question. In my experience, large churches allow for mentality to sneak in and out without getting connected. I mean, we kind of already answered this, right? I'm just not sure how that is possible to remove in the context with that opportunities.
The thing that I would say is you can hide in small churches as well, right?
Yeah.
Like you can hide in small churches. There's really unwelcoming, unfriendly small churches, just like there are really bad big churches, right? I think we've said it a bunch in this thing, but it's not the size. It's the vision.
Yes.
It's the intentionality. It's the systems. You know.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yep. Okay. How do you avoid the 20-80 rule at your church? 20% of the people doing 80% of the work.
If you can solve that, Carmen, we will hire you because it's just a problem in all churches, right? You have 20% that give 80%.
That's just
serve
people,
80%.
I feel like.
It's just people. It is.
What level of importance or helps is there in being a part of a religious organization like SBC or the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, whatever, to correct pastors' errors and shepherding congregations?
Yeah, I think there's pitfalls and there's good things with it. I think the theological accountability is great. I think having people that some of those systems that we're talking about, like if you go plant a church in the Foursquare system in SBC, a lot of those checks and balances and systems of accountability will be instituted for you. You don't get to make the decision on a lot of those things. I think the downside is we're seeing a lot of the challenges that come with these big denominations like the SBC, like the Catholic Church, where they have a bent to protect the brand and at all costs. And so
that's not good.
Yeah.
It's checks and balances. Checks and balances are good, but it also comes with oftentimes protecting powerful people, and we've seen that as well.
No question.
Is tithing a problem in churches?
I think a lack of tithing is definitely a problem in churches. I think that, we don't talk about it enough. That it's, I think God wants all of you, including your finances.
Yeah, that's good. Give generously, I would say. Give generously. Some people have a differing on, like, is the tithe literal for the New Testament? Is it not? Did Jesus echo it and affirm it? Was that before the establishment of the local ecclesia? Look, I give well above 10%.
Same.
You know what I mean? So, like, I think God's standard of generosity is probably different than the tithe. And the tithe was a little different in the Old Testament in terms of building the temple, and it was almost a tax and whatever. But I think New Testament generosity, I think, is also going to be relative to what season of life you're in, your budget, so on and so forth, right? So
I can tell you that I am a different dad, provider, husband, as somebody who relies on God financially than somebody who doesn't, because it removes the burden from me, man. Like, God, I steward what you tell me to steward. I give back to you what you tell me to give back to you.
Yeah. So I think the question, that binary is interesting, but I think generally speaking, in my opinion, casual churchgoers should give more, not less, right? And there are obviously churches that abuse that for sure, right? Can you see more of the celebrity pastors fitting the role of deacon? So, like, I think that's from our conversation.
Were talking about.
Yeah, fitting more of the role of a deacon than
I think it's a really interesting conversation for people to have going into it, to go, because again, even my role as a teaching pastor, it's much more pastoral. Even if I teach 20 times a year, right? That means that there's 32 weekends a year that I'm not standing on that stage and teaching, and most of what I'm doing is pastoring and developing. And if that's not what I feel called to do, then there's other mediums now, like YouTube and other ways to have a platform and break down scripture and share the gospel.
Yeah. And I think that to me, the best of both worlds is when we see a pastor, Mike Winger, who was, pastoring quietly at a, Southern California Calvary Chapel, and then slowly blew up on YouTube.
Yeah.
I think that's the best of both worlds. Like, guys that are both, like they're actual local church pastors, or they wanted to be, Mike Winger, Alan Parr, and they do really cool YouTube stuff. I think that to me is the best of both worlds, in my opinion.
Sounds what you're saying is I need to finally start that YouTube channel.
I've been trying to tell this man to start a YouTube channel for a long time. How do you know if you should leave a church?
Yeah, that's a big question. Again, I think what I would say is, if there's smoke, there's most likely fire. If there's a lot of hostility when you ask questions, I think that's a big sign that it might be time to start checking on other churches. I think when there's more than one time where there's things that are said that are very questionable, and there isn't I made a slip, or you ask them, hey, you said this, did you mean this? And they don't walk it back, that's where I start to go, okay, I'm not going to plant my family here. But also understand you're around humans, that are going to make mistakes.
That's good. Here's a good question. What's the hardest thing about being a pastor?
Yeah, I would say the hardest thing for me being a pastor is it's hard to have environments where people don't have a massive expectation of you to be like this perfect human, where I think we inherently know that pastors are humans, but there's a part of it where you still feel like they can't make mistakes. Because for us, unlike the general public, when I make a mistake, I lose my family's income, right? My kids can't eat because I lose my job when I make the mistake. And so when sin is in a smaller arena where you can deal with it before it becomes these big things, that's where I think the church has to do a better job of going, hey, it's okay for pastors to raise their hand and say it's not okay, that they're not okay, and deal with it before it becomes this huge thing. But there's this internal pressure, whether it's whether it's external or internal, it's probably a combination of both, where you just feel like, I can't ever do that. I've got to just be perfect. And so I think pastors have to be really intentional to find environments and people where they can say those things, and they can, but again, you have to seek it out. You have to be intentional with it. Otherwise, you just will begin to believe that you have to be what people expect you to be.
Yeah, that's good. This is a cool question. What is the role of Gen Z / early 20-year-olds in the church? How can we better be involved, especially since the church does not feel catered to us?
Yeah, man, Jacob, I think that is the question that gets me the most excited. I look at the future of the church and the Gen Z, the next generation, and all of the politics, all the BS, the church stuff that we just do because we're a church. I look at the next generation and go, man, revival is in your hands. I think revival and the future of the church is literally in your hands, that you have to begin to believe this thing enough to live it out and to start to go all in and just to go, look, even though some of this stuff feels wonky and I don't really understand it, the answer is not to walk away from it.
Yeah.
And so I think the church has responsibility to go, we have to adapt this and we have to change our messaging and create an atmosphere where they are welcome, but it also is going to require the people in that generation to become the hands and feet of the church and to step in and begin to serve and to, but it excites me more than anything because I just go, man, this is a generation where I think we are, again, what you were talking about, from a historical standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, we are ripe for revival, again, for another massive move of God. And I think it's going to happen with enough Gen Z folks going, hey, I believe this thing, man, let's do this.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good question. I see the Oneness Pentecostal question. I'm going to come back to that. Just give me a second. It's a good question. How do you deal with the LGBTQ plus people going to your church? When do you press them on repentance? And how long is too long them going to your church and still living in the lifestyle?
Yeah.
Turning up the heat.
Yeah, that's
Let's
great.
go.
Yeah.
Come on.
So, again, I know
this is why I don't want to be a pastor,
we,
by the way.
we love this question, right? So, again, I'll just say that these last Christmas Eve services, we had close to 15,000 people, right? In that audience of 15,000 people, if there was what they say the general public is 3% in the LGBTQ.
Oh, no, bro. It's 1 out of 5 for Gen Z that identify.
That's a whole nother can of worms.
Crazy.
But, okay.
One out of 10 for our generation, 1 out of 5 for Gen Z.
Okay, so again, I'll ask it a different way.
Yeah.
Were there more people in our church setting that were LGBTQ plus, or were same or heterosexual, but living outside of the confines of God's design for their relationship?
How many people are cohabitating?
How many of them are, looking at pornography? How many are, not pursuing intimacy with their wife?
Yes.
A higher percentage of those people or the LGBTQ people. So again, I would ask the question is, how long should we let the heterosexual couple stay in the church that are continuing to live together? I know more of those couples off the top of my head that I can think of.
Wow.
Are there a handful of couples in our church that are same-sex attracted, some of them married, that come to church every weekend? Yes, 1,000%. And I love it. Where else would we want them to be? Like, where else do we want them to be? Do you want me at some point to actually start a clock and go, these people have a year. Once they walk in the doors, they have a year to get their crap together and figure this out, stop being gay, stop being attracted to people that look like them. And if not, then I'm going to approach them and say they can't be in this church. So I think it's a really silly question to ask, and we've made it into this issue that is, it's so ludicrous, man. I think if we get the rest of the church, and if every heterosexual in our church began to follow and honor God with their sexuality, I think the LGBTQ community might be much more willing to listen to us, to go, oh, maybe there is some practical application to this thing, because they seem like their marriages are better. Their divorce rates are lower, right? They are enjoying and thriving. And so I think it's just a silly question to ask. I think we need people in the church.
Well, I think there's also a difference between somebody attending and someone being in leadership.
No question.
Right.
And what I'm also not saying is that we go to the line where we affirm this and we don't, in the series when it makes sense, call it out for what it is and let Scripture define what God's design. I mean, I'm reading through Genesis right now. It's like, man, from the very beginning, God designed them male and female. But like, to say that is like some heretical statement now. It's like, no, from the very beginning, it's been male and female. It's pretty black and white. You know?
I think we should spend a lot more time also preaching the ways of God instead of preaching what's outside. We got to do both.
Yeah.
But I think when we just hammer down on this specific sin, and then like it's referenced a handful of times, and it's a serious sin. Sexual sin in general is a serious sin. But
different,
when it's only referenced a handful of times in Scripture, and then like the tension of like, well, when are you gonna sit him down? You know what I mean? And it's like, man, I've had to sit down folks that I knew were fornicating that were in leadership. You remember that?
Oh yeah.
That was really hard.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Those conversations are really hard. But I feel like we got to have just scales. The couple that's living together, the couple that's sleeping together, the dude that's habitually looking at porn and still wants to lead worship. All of these things fall under the same type of sexual sin. Now, granted, there's different consequences.
Sure.
Absolutely. But I think when we elevate this specific thing as this big thing that like, they got a time limit and they got to be asked not to come back around, right? Like I'm counseling people in my real life that are dealing with this stuff.
Yeah.
Like folks that are like, man, I'm same-sex attracted, but I think I'm bi, but I don't know.
That's
and it just rests. And what do? Man, you got 2 months to figure this out, dog, or I can't mentor you no more. Like it's so weird.
Again, I'm okay with people that have some of those struggles that are serving in church, right? I'm thinking high levels of leadership positions. But if we were to go through and to know every single person that shows up on a Sunday, for us, it's a small army that it takes to pull off a Sunday with the number of volunteers that we have. And if we could know every single thing they were dealing with in the secret, I almost guarantee you that all the designations of LGBTQ would be like small in comparison to what other people are dealing with, right? And so people are people. They're going to do people things. Where I think there becomes a dangerous line is when it's, no, this is who I am, and I refuse to back down. I want you to affirm this, and this is who I am. But like people, if they're in process, rad, man. Praise God that they're there. And if we have them holding a sign or helping people park and trying to figure out their faith, that's a beautiful thing. But we have to also, again, I think just have the full conversations of God's standards for sexuality and not just alienate one.
Right.
Because, again, man, I think people know where the church stands on these issues. I don't think people need to know that we believe that homosexuality is a sin, right? I think that, again, there's churches that are going the other route. But
no, absolutely. And I think it's just such an interesting conversation. And there's a spectrum of views within there. Like there's side B folks who identify as same-sex attracted, but they're celibate, right? But they're not gonna say they're not same-sex attracted. There's such a wild spectrum of people within that community that I think it's better to shepherd and love and pastor. But at the same time, like I'm not. I would be shocked if someone was in a same-sex marriage leading worship. You know, that'd be like,
that'd be a miss.
Yeah, but how? When is that? Like seldom. I don't think I've ever heard. I think I've heard of someone being in a public relationship, like on stage in a choir once. You know what I mean, or something like that. But usually these things don't happen. I don't think someone who is participant in that lifestyle should be volunteering in the kids ministry or youth ministry. I think passing out coffee is okay. Yeah, I would agree. I think that's a fair point. Okay, I'm trying to see if there's any good ones. If you see any good ones you want me to throw up, let me know. We already did the small groups. Oh, this is kind of a cool one.
False teaching.
Yeah. How do mega churches ensure that the small groups are teaching the right doctrine and are kept safe from false teaching? Does the church make sure small group leaders are qualified to lead? That's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the question is what are small groups going through, right? And we don't set up the small group leader to be like a pastor. Like this is the leader. We more refer to them as facilitators. They're there to facilitate a discussion that's primarily around something that pastors have put together and curated for them to walk through. The scriptures are all pre-set up. So we try to lower the bar of what a leader really is, both because you need a lot of leaders at scale to have as many small groups as you need. And so we've lowered the bar to go, hey, you don't have to be some, biblical savant that has gone through seminary to lead a small group. You just have to be able to facilitate a discussion, keep conversation going, ask the questions that are already there, and be willing to host. If you're willing to do any of those things, you're qualified, right? Now, what does happen is you have the guy that is really excited, wants to be a pastor, but clearly no churches are giving him a platform. And so unintentionally, you end up giving that guy a group, and then it becomes, this is his ministry. He's preaching weird stuff, and you have to kind of, that's where you have small groups, pastors, you have systems and checks and balances that can kind of catch some of that, hopefully earlier than it happens. But for us, we try to, again, at scale, give them something that lets them facilitate a conversation instead of, hey, you're the one that comes up with the content, you create all of this, and then you have to do ongoing trainings and stuff. But
yeah. This is an interesting question. Is there a need for celebrity status privileges in churches? Meaning, I think he's talking like special seating, like if Justin Bieber shows up to your church, like are you guys going to seat him somewhere else? Like, is there a need for this sort of thing? I think that's what he's asking.
Yeah. So again, I think there's a level, he said celebrity pastor stuff too. I think there's a part of it where there is practical stuff in that, right? At the size church we are, you just get some crazies that are there. So like we need to have security that's around people that are the communicators to keep people safe. We have a designated parking spot for them to come. We have some celebrities and we have a lot of, football players and, but nobody's like a Justin Bieber's walking in the doors of our church, or at least hasn't yet. Yeah. If they did, I think there would probably need to be some separate processes created for them to feel safe and be able to come into a church setting.
Just from a crowd control standpoint.
100%. Yeah, because people are going to people. You know what I mean? And like if Taylor Swift walk in to our church, my daughter is going to be the one that like security's going to need to be held back. Like just freak out, But yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Question. Thoughts on Church of the Highlands and Chris Hodges? Pastor Restoration Ministry. Are you familiar with this?
I think roughly. There's another one out in Texas. There's a church called Watermark Church, and they have a restoration ministry where their statement is for any person on staff that has a moral failure, they have basically a written policy that says we will take you through a restoration process where you will eventually, at the end of this, you'll have the opportunity to be restored back to your position.
Wow.
Almost regardless of what happens.
Whoa.
And so...
Whoa. Unless it's like illegal and you're going to prison.
Sure, yeah. Okay. If you're in prison, you're probably not going to be back in ministry.
Okay,
but again, somebody that has some type of an affair, it could be a 5-year process they have to go through, but they've taken pastors that have had major moral failures, given them positions on facilities while they're going
Hold on. On facilities is in like cleaning toilets and stuff?
Straight up.
That's gangster.
While they're going through like a gnarly restoration process, counseling, healing with whatever's going on. Yeah. And at the end, and they say a lot of them self-select out of the process.
Of course they do.
But from the church's standpoint, and Chris Brown has some rad stories about, there was a guy that actually stole a guitar from us, the church we were at in the movement, that was one of their worship leaders. He was having a bunch of issues. He stole one of our guitars, came into the church, and we caught him, called him out. He showed up to worship on one Sunday night with this like $7,000 guitar, and all the worship leaders were geeking out on it. Like, where'd you get that? That's so rad. He made up this whole false story. Yeah. It all comes out. Yeah. Chris, and he'll probably tell you the story in more detail, they put that dude through a restoration process, gave him a job in facilities, walked him through like a 1.5 year long process to go, hey man, there's this thing you're dealing with where you're stealing stuff and trying to lead worship, and like there's some issues.
You're a thief, bro.
There's some issues in your heart, bro. But that dude is
Hold on, do I know who this person is?
Yeah.
Okay.
That dude is a worship leader now at North Coast.
Wow.
Went through the whole process and is amazing. And so I love that stuff. Anything that goes, hey, people are going to people, and let's build systems that don't create margin for their sin, but also creates a process where they can, just like anybody, can be restored. Yeah. I love that stuff.
How interesting, bro.
Yeah.
Wow. So so if someone goes through an adultery and divorce, they'll still walk it through with them and reestablish them.
100%. Wow. And again, it could be 4 or 5 years, but there is a thing that, hey, at the end of this road could get to a place where you could be restored.
I believe he's talking about Mike and Carter. It's public information, who was restored after allegations of grape, but he stepped down again. Okay, well,
that's a whole other can of worms.
When is it okay to address politics at the pulpit?
Yeah, well, we address politics all the time. We talk about politics regularly because the culture we live in is now politics and faith have become really blended. We had a guy that said he was leaving the church because a couple weeks ago I preached a message. We were doing a series on 1 Corinthians 13 and love is and how we are supposed to be what Jesus said, people who are marked and known by our love. That's the defining thing. And I made a statement in the opening week talking about, love is patient, that some of you are going to be shocked when you get to heaven and there's Democrats in heaven. And somebody literally
How dare you?
wrote an email, said that they're leaving the church because how dare I stand up there with the audacity and say that. As somebody that's very right-leaning and Republican, the fact that you even, we've gotten to a spot where our faith no longer informs our politics. Our politics is now informing our faith.
And that's gross.
And that's off. No matter where you land, left, right, in the middle, that's a huge miss. And so we try to talk about politics a lot, but we are not the church. If you come and you want the super right wing or the super liberal leaning, you're just going to be really frustrated by us because we don't take a hard stance on that. We believe that, Democrats and Republicans, majority of the stuff, we want the same thing. We want our kids to have an opportunity to grow up in a free country and have an opportunity of life. So
that's kind of wild, bro.
Yeah, it's wild.
That's wild that we could disagree with Democrats politically or whatever, but to assume that someone who's placed their faith in Jesus and maybe voted in a way that I would say doesn't align with some of the values in Scripture is therefore then not saved?
Yeah, man.
Again, soteriology. How do you even know what the gospel is?
No.
Because the gospel doesn't say if you don't believe what you're supposed to believe politically, you're not saved. It says if you believe in Jesus as the propitiation for your sins, you are then declared saved.
That's right.
So that's just so weird how we conflate those two things. You know?
Man. Again, I think you said it though. Most people don't know what they believe.
Yeah. Okay. Is there any other good ones in here before we
I saw the one at the top. I think that's
This
an
one right
interesting one. How do I navigate being a motivated young believer to preach the gospel in a church who needs help but has no vision? Yeah. Eric, I would tell you, man, if you're a young motivated person and you're in a church and you feel called to that church for this season, I would be willing to be a part of it. I think that we so often can check out when God might have you there for a specific reason, man. Plug in, see how you can help. Fix problems, don't come in with all the solutions, but just go, hey, how can I help? How can I move this thing along? And at some point, if you outgrow it and you want to go somewhere else, do it, man. I think it's awesome.
This is a good question. When did you realize that becoming a pastor or teaching the word in some aspect was your calling, and what was the situation surrounding that? That's a great question.
Yeah, I think calling is again, a very biblical thing that we see all over the Bible, right? That calling is, but it's also something that we've made hyper supernatural. And I think calling is best understood as a combination of desire. Number one, do you actually desire to do this? Because not everybody desires to work at a church and deal with all of the stuff that comes along with it. So if you desire it, you have the ability to do it, right? You act, and that's the part that people struggle with is self-assessment isn't always strong. But I think where the defining characteristic of this comes in is there's also opportunity. Where you're given opportunity, you desire to do it, and you're good enough to do it. I think that is what is the very making of a calling. For me specifically, it was a process that took years and years to play out, but it goes back to even when I was newly saved. I used to sit in church at the movement and have visions that I was during worship, and I didn't even know what a vision was. I had visions that I was preaching on that stage. And, then I went through a process where God just started opening doors and started teaching and started to enjoy it and had more doors open. And in that process, I started to go, oh, maybe this is what God's calling me to do. Because I really liked it. I really enjoyed it. And I just felt like the peace of God on it.
Yeah, well, in your case, and I would say also in Jeff Moore's case, you guys are both unicorns in that you're great communicators, but you also love shepherding people. Yeah, you are naturally pastoral, and you ask questions, and you're good with people, and you're good with people's mess and people's processes. Yeah, right. Where I don't have that same burden for people. I have a burden in let me guide you, But the moment you start coming to me with the same problem over and over, and we solved it 6 months ago, I'm like, bro, you're wasting my time. You're not really trying to make a change. You're just playing games.
Yeah.
What are we doing here, right? And I feel like and correct me if I'm wrong, from my experience, there's a lot of that in church.
Yeah, no question.
There's a lot of people who, it's almost like they don't really want answers to their problems. They just want to vent to someone they feel is a spiritual authority.
For sure.
And I can't play that game.
Yeah, and there's a level of that that's always a part of people, right? And part of the challenge that I have now is at our scale, even it's like, okay, how do I and who do I do this with? Like, because just from a time standpoint, I can't shepherd everybody in our community. So what do I do? Well, the best advice I was ever given is walk with those that want it and love those that don't. And for that guy, that same thing, 2 or 3 times, and I just go, and there's guys in my life that, potentially watch this that know. I tell them, hey, bro, look, I know you're struggling with porn, and you think I'm somehow going to be the mystical resolution because you've admitted it to me. But look, here's what's going to happen between this appointment and the next appointment that we'll have. Yeah. You have to commit to 2 minutes a day of praying and reading your Bible. Yeah. And if you show up next time in 2 weeks,
2 minutes?
Start somewhere.
This man,
you got to start somewhere, dog. You got to start somewhere.
This man said you just got to pray for 2 minutes a day, bro.
Dumb it down. But again, if we show up in 2 weeks, the first question I'm going to ask you is, did you for the last 2 weeks pray and read your Bible for 2 minutes a day? And if the answer is no, then the next meeting we have, I'll give you the same opportunity. And if it happens the third time, then at that point, you don't really want my help.
Yeah, 3 strikes you're out.
Because I can't help you. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a therapist. I'm a pastor.
Do you defer people to therapists and counselors?
All the time. Yeah. And the cool part about being at a church our size is we have counselors and therapists, licensed counselors, not just pastors that like counseling, on staff. And we have a budget for that. It's a resource that we have. We have a whole ministry around it. And so we can...
So good, because that's not a pastor's job necessarily.
Well, and there's a lot of things that, again, as a pastor, I'm not trained in that. Yeah. I'm not qualified to walk through somebody's childhood trauma with them. Can I relate? Can I share shared experiences with them? Can I pray with them? Can I be a place to listen? Yes and amen. But at some point, for me to walk through all the childhood trauma I walked through, it took a year every week with a licensed therapist that, as I look back, she methodically walked me through a process to get me to healing. Yeah. And I never could have done that. And so that's where as pastors, it's like, man, don't do or don't try to be what you aren't. Yeah. And even if you don't have the context, whether you have pastors or, counselors on staff, find a great resource that you can plug in with. There are big churches around you that have counselors that you can reach out to. Yeah. When I was here, I used to send them all to North Coast Calvary.
Yeah, North Coast Calvary Chapel here. That's right. What is that, Carlsbad, technically? They have a great program. Here's a good question. How do you handle the topic of sex in the church to not make it taboo, but a gift from God?
Yeah, I think you have to just talk about it. Talk about it for what it is. It's a beautiful gift that God's given us. It's something that we as the church should be the leading voices on. And we talk the most about it. It's the greatest gift God gave humanity. Yeah. That literally is the thing that took them from being one and made them, or took them into being 2 individuals and made them into one. And so I think we need to talk a lot about it. I think the cool part is your buddy, I'm blanking on his name, that has the podcast Upset the Gram.
Oh, Tim Ross, Pastor Tim Ross.
He's been talking very openly about a lot of stuff. Yeah, he does
a good job.
And dude, it's awesome. Yes. I love it. And I think the church needs to be, we have to move away from the weird, this is taboo, we can't talk about this stuff in church. And
all right. I think we're gonna start wrapping up. This might be the last question, unless you see anything else in here. I'll scroll through the questions one more time. We got a tongues question. Someone asked about oneness apostolic, oneness Pentecostal, which I really don't want to get into unless you want to talk about that. But here's a good question. This is a conversation I find interesting. Yeah. Why are we seeing a rise of sort of feminist concepts within the church? Is this why young men are not attracted to church, and why the divorce seems to be the same in church and outside the church, which it's not, by the way.
I was going to say, that's not a true statistic. Not true. Yeah.
Practicing Christians who make above the average income, the higher the income and the more active you are in faith, are statistically the least likely to get divorced. This is an unequivocal fact that the red pill community unfortunately always admits, and it's gross that they do this. But if you're a practicing Christian, if you're a virgin or have had less than a few partners, And if you make above whatever the average income is, the higher your income, the least likely you are to get divorced. Or I think if income alone plateaus at about like 20% once you make a certain amount. And then when you're practicing, go to church, and you have a lower body count, lower number of partners, it completely dissipates.
Well, and there's one practice that essentially divorce-proofs your entire
Prayer, right?
marriage.
Yeah.
Praying daily with your spouse is almost there's almost no divorces of couples who literally pray together every day. So that's a kind of a two-part question. The first part that he's talking about is seeing a rise in feminist concepts within the church. Is this why young men are not attracted? I think yes and amen. I think the biggest thing, again, I'm reading through the book of Genesis because we're going to be teaching it coming up, is God so clearly made man and female, and there's order, there's structure, there's reason, there's design behind it. And the reality is the husbands can either lead their home or Satan can lead their home. Like those are the two options.
Come on.
Right? And you see that all the way back in the very beginning. And so a lot of what's happened, though, is men have shirked away from their responsibilities as the leaders in the church, the leaders in their homes. And so women have just done their best to step up and try to fill that gap. And we're now living in a culture that has moved further and further into this and has exacerbated the problem to a point that I think we need to recommunicate to culture. There's a biblical mandate for men. Men and women are different. Different's not good or bad. It's just different. And we have different roles to play. But men have to be the leader. They have to be the ones to pick up the mantle and go, this is our responsibility. It's the curse that was placed on us in the Garden of Eden, that we are the ones that are going to work and toil and wrestle through that stuff. And we can't just take that and throw it on our wives and make them do it. And so I believe one of the paths of, even as the guy was asking the Gen Z question, we need biblical manhood to come back and to go. But again, what is biblical manhood? It's not this red pill, hyper, manly dude that, has a beard and shoots guns and votes Republican. It's like really.
There's nothing wrong with doing those things.
No, I do all of those things.
You do all those
I
things.
Live in that's why I moved from
this
California
man
to
got a lot
Arizona.
of firearms, ladies and gentlemen.
You better believe that. There's a reason I stayed in Arizona.
Yeah.
But again, I think just biblical manhood of going, this is who we are. This is what we do. And it's not bad. It's an amazingly beautiful thing that God has created with intention.
Yeah, and this is stuff we've talked about for years. In our group, we talked about masculinity.
We've been saying this stuff for a decade.
Yeah. So that's the part that to me was always hilarious with like the rise of all this red pill stuff. And I'm just kind of like, like, first of all, the church has been talking about this. In our local context, we've been talking about biblical masculinity. We've been talking about learning how to provide for your home. We've been talking about how to allow your wife the opportunity to stay home with the kids, especially when they're little kids. Like, we've been saying this stuff for 15 years, man. So the fact that this stuff is like now mainstream, I just think is hilarious, So yeah, I think there's truth to all that. I think what happens though in some of these other, like you said, secular conversations, when you remove the gospel from it, then it becomes a self-defeating process of go out and be a pickup artist and learn game and learn how to pick up girls. Oh, and by the way, the nuclear family matters. And you know what I mean? Virgins are popular. It's like, wait a minute, you are deflowering all the virgins or girls that are next to virgins with this stupid ideology that you say is it's so backwards. If you actually care about that topic, then you would marry a woman and like love her well and lead her well. Like that's how that would look, not what you see. And I'm not saying he's coming from that perspective, but that's a lot of the stuff on that end of the world, that end of the spectrum within the red pill space. And so, I don't know.
Yeah, man, again, part of what we did in that group every Monday was we raised the bar to what I think the minimum biblical standards are, to just go, hey, we need accountability. We need people to help us walk this thing out. And the part that always blew my mind is every time the church tried to send us more people in a small group, the feedback was always that our group was too intense and we didn't have a high enough attrition rate. Because we would pull people to a standard and go, look, man, we're going to do a 10-week session and we asked you not to miss more than twice. And
or you get kicked out.
You're not coming back. And people go, oh, it's just too hard of a standard. But the basic premise
show up every week, bro. That's too hard.
this will be a microcosm of the rest of your life. If you're not showing up here, I promise you're not showing up in other places. But that, again, I think is something that we just need. These voices need to be amplified, right?
A newlywed, how do I incorporate prayer with my wife and Bible study with my family?
Yeah, I would say do it in any way that you're able to make it happen. And I know it's not a specific enough answer, but I think figure out a way, a rhythm that works with you and your wife and your family. That could be at dinner, that could be at the end of the night, that could be in the morning, whatever it takes for you to make it happen. Also understanding, it's gotten better over time. But for me, the most uncomfortable person for me to pray with has always been my spouse.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but it's the most unnatural. It's the most difficult thing to get into the rhythm of. But once you do it, and I think it's Craig Rochelle that always says, if you ever miss a day of praying with your wife, just don't miss 2, right? Like, make sure you don't go more than 2 or 3 days without praying with your spouse. It's okay when stuff happens, but figure out a way to make it happen.
And it is hard. There's something about praying with your spouse.
Dude, it
that's
is.
It's just
It's
weird.
tough.
It's tough. I don't know
think
what it is.
I think answer that tension and just acknowledge it, and even tell her, hey, I'm trying to figure this out, and just figure it out together. I think that's the beauty of marriage.
Oneness Pentecostalism. Are you familiar?
No.
Oneness view of the Trinity. You're not familiar?
I mean, superficially.
It's an error. That's it. It's an error. Okay. Don't be an error.
That's right.
If you need resources, there's a lot of really good teaching about the Trinity and Jesus not being created, him being co-eternal, him not being a thought of God, him not, there's a lot of resources.
Mormonism.
It is. Mormonism kind of has similar views of like Jesus being like created and not being eternal. And so I would say spend some good time studying the Godhead and explore that. And if you see your church preaching something that's against what is historical Christianity,
that's right,
I say you got to bounce. You know what I mean? And by historical Christianity, I just mean like oneness. The view of oneness or modalism is the minority view, and it's a relatively modern view. There was a slight a couple hundred years into the church, the heresy sprouted up and it instantly got shut down. And then down the road, it didn't really resurge until about 150 years ago. Like it's relatively, and I'm weary of anything that's relatively modern. Young Earth creationism, relatively modern. The rapture, relatively modern. Oneness Pentecostalism, relatively modern. I could keep going. A lot of when like the church for 2,000 years has believed one thing, and then somebody comes along and be like, nah, I got the revelation.
Yeah.
And by the way, we're the only ones that got it right, and everybody else got it wrong, and they're all corrupt. Like that's
a dangerous position.
Super culty vibes to me on any issue. By the way, on any issue. So just be weary of that. Like if your sect or your camp plucks one thing out and says the rest of Christendom is wrong, or everyone's
Thousands
wrong.
of years of
Guys that know the original language, guys that, you know what I mean? Everyone else is wrong, but your camp, because then it gets into like really like conspiratorial type thinking, and they pull the wool over your eyes, and right, and it's all corrupt. I would just be very, very, very weary of that because if it's not found in historical Christianity, there's not a consensus on it. I would just say be very, very careful of that, and go and actually look at what did the early church believe? What did the church fathers believe? What did the reformers believe? Right? What do all these great thinkers believe? And you'll find that the Trinity, at the very least, the divinity and co-eternality with Jesus, that's unanimous. Like that's been settled for thousands of years. My brother Truther Talks is in here. He comes from a oneness background, and so Truther, I would check out Truther's channel. Maybe reach out to him. Truther might be more of a resource on this than I will be. But there's a lot of guys that have came out of it that I think would be very helpful. Ivan said, I think you might be a little spoiled by your local church. I've seen that there's absence of deep teaching for men and mentors. Yeah. Hey, Ivan, and I'm very honest about this. I have a selection bias. I have selection bias with the way we talked about manhood. I have selection bias with the way we talked about marriage and a lot of young men getting married and people still getting married. How many couples you know that have been married within the last 2 years?
A lot.
I know at least a dozen.
A lot, yeah.
At least a dozen. So I absolutely have a selection bias. But my pushback would be like, well, shouldn't we study the outliers?
Yeah.
Like if you want to get married, shouldn't you study people that got married? If you want to have a great local church, shouldn't you listen to the people that went to a great local church, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, manipulation, being manipulated by, you could talk about this for hours, man.
Yeah.
We got to protect some people in this conversation. But yeah, I mean, we've gone through, you say it because I don't want to get in trouble.
Again, man, I think leadership manipulation is a very subtle thing. That's, if you're new in your faith, that's when I would have the biggest alarm bells there, because that's typically where it happens. Most people seasoned in their faith can see through a lot of the things. They can smell what's there. But either way, I think I just walked through this with a friend of mine that was looking at a pastor job, and he was calling me to go, hey man, there was these things that happened in the interview process that was like, I don't know about this. What do you think about this? And I was like, dog, I'm telling you, there's smoke all over this thing. I can't tell you where, but there's fire somewhere. These fools made him, they gave him an offer letter, but they wouldn't send it to him. They wouldn't email him the offer letter. They made him show up in person. They slid it across the table with the number, and then they took it away from him, gave him an hour to make a decision.
Whoa.
And I was like, just that process.
That's weird.
Completely bizarre, completely weird. Normal churches don't do this stuff. It's very, hey, this is who we are. So have people in your life that you can go to and ask questions. And, just realize people are people. But I also think 95% of the pastors out there, man, are incredibly faithful people that are just trying to do their best.
Yes.
And I think sometimes they'll unintentionally make poor decisions. They will allow fear to creep into their minds, like everybody, and go, oh man, I have to hold on to this. I can't be open-handed with leaders because the money's going to go away. And then if my message is like, they're just human. So give people margin for error. Realize that we all have the propensity to control and make mistakes.
Yeah, and I would also add, just because someone is around people or is a part of someone that was manipulated, that doesn't mean everyone in that institution is the same way.
100%.
Because sometimes people don't know. Sometimes, and that's when I said we, protect people. I'm talking about people that were around that weren't necessarily complicit. You know what I mean? And they got hurt in the process too.
Yep.
So I think we have to be. I think we also have to be careful in that. All right, man. Any final thoughts, final words of encouragement before we get out of here? You could look into that camera right there up above, the one right there, and talk to the people.
I think the biggest thing that I would say to all of you is, even on channels like this, like, man, I wish that as a newer Christian that there was resources like this. I mean, when I was first saved, there's an amazing resource out there called gotquestions.org, where it wasn't even a website back then. It was literally a book that they printed, and I would go to that to seek answers and to find clarification on things I didn't understand. Use all of these amazing YouTube guys that are out there and girls that are trying to do God's work and create opportunities for these discussions to happen. It's a beautiful resource that I think the church needs, that I think some combination of all of this is what the church looks like in the future. But also, my biggest thing to you, if you're not connected to a local church, is find one, figure out a way to get plugged in, because the local church is how your life will transform. Whether it's a church of 60 or a church of 60,000. 60,000 is a big number.
It's a big number. It's the Mike Todd numbers right there.
Find a place where you can be plugged in and use resources like this to vet it and walk through it. But don't let this be your primary community, because it's not.
Yes.
And it can be part of the lie that the enemy uses for you. This should be a supplement to the community that you have.
Yeah, and we use that in terminology a lot. This is a supplement. This is not your sustenance. Your sustenance is the Word of God, your relationship with God, you getting into a local church. Where can they find you? What church do you go to? What church are you pastoring at? And how could they find you?
Yeah, Rock Point Church, Gilbert, Arizona. My website is danielgoulding.com. Got everything, latest messages and all that stuff are on there. Instagram is probably where I'm most active. Daniel M. Goulding on there. Would love to connect with anybody and answer any questions that I have. As somebody that loves the local church, even though she is a messy bride in the right light.
There you go. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching this. If you enjoyed this, check out Daniel Goulding on all platforms. Check out the church. Pull up in person. Come say hello. Shake his hand. He's actually an amazing human. And we will be back tomorrow with some more videos. In the meantime, if you want to partner with us, if you want to help us continue contextualizing the gospel and stay independent, so I don't got to do goofy brand deals and sell you guys VPNs and razors, partner with us on Patreon. That's the best way to support what we're doing, all right? Here's a little preview of my new song, and we're out of here. Love you guys. Peace.
Later, guys.
Hey, you may not know I make music, but I have a brand new song that just came out. Here's a quick preview.
I went from being a porn addict to sharing the gospel with a porn actress who was criticized for being low status by the same OnlyFans who treat us so lavish. I'm confused.
I swear y'all thought he did doing podcasts, hot takes. He still can rap.
Now, this is my first song that I've released in over a year, so I need you to go to Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you consume music and stream Too Soon right now. Add it to your favorite playlist, share it with a friend. So hit the link in the description or go to RuslanToTheMoon.com to stream Too Soon now. I'll see you over there.
Ooh, ooh. Oh, they got me with the dramatics. You knew that a moment cannot be static too soon.
Ruslan.